Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second episode of the as yet untitled Matthew Matos's podcast. Maybe that's just the name of the podcast now. I don't know. I was going to call it Talking Crit, but it seems like that's already taken. So I thought that was a clever name. But anyway, um, yeah, we're just going to go for it again. It's daytime here, so you might get to hear some of the noises out my window of cars driving by, but there you go. We're not going to dwell on it too much. I don't want to be that guy that constantly apologizes for audio quality in the podcast, so we're just going to move on. This time around, I'm still going to continue to take questions on games themselves because it's what I've always tried to focus on the channel and stuff, and that's just what I'm most interested in talking about. Maybe I'll cover other stuff on another podcast. I'm sure I can't do this forever. I've got to vary it up at some point if we're going to keep doing this. So we'll see how it goes. Before I get into any of the questions, though, one thing I wanted to do was I wanted to talk a little bit about what happened last time. So I think it would be good to talk a little bit about the comments and for a couple of reasons. Basically, some good stuff can happen in the comments from time to time, and of course, people who are listening to this way later might not have access to the comments. Like, for example, if it's, YouTube could have gone under. I mean, it's a possibility that we can't ignore. Or I could have gone mental and I could have, deleted all the comments or something. And also, you could be listening on SoundCloud or somewhere else and you might not have access to the comments, or you might just not be interested in reading them. But there's still some valuable stuff in there, and I think that especially since last time around, I actually called and asked for comments on the whole East versus West topic. It would be good to get into them. So without further ado, I had a couple of things that I wanted to bring up. First of all, there was a good response to the question, so thank you everybody who commented. I know I asked for comments and I got a lot of them, and it was all generally very respectful. So I want you all to give you all yourselves a pat on the back for that. There was some umbrage taken at the fact that I was even discussing the whole East versus West thing in the first place. And I do want to say that it's not a topic that I dwell on personally. It's not something that I really wanted to get into. I've said as much on the Ask FM page before. But when I started talking about it, I do think that what I said made a lot of sense. So I don't regret saying any of that at all. And another thing was, I think one of the big points that came up a lot in comments was people weren't happy to hear me talking about The Witcher so much. And one thing I'd like to say is that I will totally cop to the fact that I haven't played the Witcher games. I was talking purely speculatively about them. And this is part of the contract you're entering into when you listen to these podcasts, is that you understand that it's not I can't do off the cuff what I can do in a video when I've done a lot of research and actually played all the games I'm talking about and all that sort of stuff. Sometimes I'm gonna have to talk about things I'm not quite as knowledgeable about. It's just a reality, of doing a podcast. And so I'd like people to keep that in mind when you're listening. Try not to. I saw one of the comments I think was asking for timestamps, and obviously timestamps to the questions is good. Some other commenter did it, and that's fine. But I think it was the person said that they'd like timestamps in case they ever want to go over my answers again. And something about that sounded kind of sinister to me. Like, oh, if obviously I'm not saying that they actually meant it this way, but just when you read it as the person who has answered all these questions, in case I want to go over your answer again, they probably just liked the podcast and just wanted to be able to hear some of these things again. But there's also this sort of this tone to it in my head of, oh, if I want to, pick apart what you've said about this thing again, then just really get into that. And it's off the cuff, and it's, I even said it in the podcast. I totally copped to the fact that I haven't played The Witcher. It was pure speculation, but I think the best point that came up was really that I probably should have talked about GTA instead, because I've actually played them. And another thing that occurred to me in afterwards when I was in the comments was that Zelda sort of is a counterexample of what I was talking about, where it doesn't skew quite as heavily as many other Japanese games, where it's a nice mix of exploration, puzzle solving, and combat. And part of the appeal of the game is how it sort of blends those things together in a way that lots of other games don't. And the same is also true of GTA and The Witcher and all that kind of stuff as well. So yeah, it was overall a good sort of feedback on that stuff. One thing I do want to say, and this again, I'm going to talk about The Witcher, even though I haven't played it, so try not to get your pitchforks out. But one commenter I think possibly nailed the issue on the head better than I did. And by the way, I want to say I'm not going to be reading out names. I don't even have the comments in front of me actually. I'm not going to be reading out names just in case you wouldn't want your name read out. I don't know whether you would or not, so I don't. I hope nobody takes disrespect to the fact that I'm not naming anybody. It's just purely for the sake of privacy. You might not want to have your name read out. Like if you get attention on your comment because I bring it up or something, and then you can go and delete that and it's gone, and you're entitled to do that. Whereas if I say your name in the podcast, it's here, and there's nothing you can do about it. And I sure as shit, I'm gonna go back and bleep out names or something. So, so I'm not gonna mention names. I hope everybody understands why I won't do that. But yeah, one commenter I think hit the nail on the head better than I did, which was they talked about The Witcher and they said for them, and I think it would be the same for me. So again, I haven't played it, but my partner has played it, and we live in a small apartment, so I've seen a fair chunk of the game while she's been playing it. And one thing I think it would be true for me, again, speculation. I don't want to have to keep couching everything I say as this is speculation, this isn't, I haven't played the game, so just, okay, I've said it once, I'm done. Okay, so he said anyway that for him, in the Witcher games, it's not the fact that it has combat that's, like having combat is fine. The problem was that, you go in and you want to be Geralt or whatever. You want to get into the story and the role playing and the sort of stuff that the game is really there for, to drag you into the world. And you have these combat systems, and the combat isn't very good. And again, I haven't played the game. I'm paraphrasing the comment here. And the point anyway was that the combat was bad or unenjoyable or mediocre or whatever whatever level you want to peg it at. It was at the point where it was unenjoyable to the point where it actively subtracted from the game for him. And I think that kind of gets to the core of what I was talking about more. Whereas the point I was kind of making was that the Japanese games, by focusing on one thing, it maybe the point is more about what they're excluding. They're excluding the stuff that doesn't work. Whereas in something like The Witcher, you have the combat, and I think I would feel the same way, judged based on what I've seen about the combat. Is I think when if I was playing the combat in The Witcher, which is a big part of it, I mentioned races and stuff like that last time, and somebody rightfully pointed out that that's a very small part of the game. You're absolutely right, but something like the combat would be a large part of the game. I think we could all agree to that. And if the combat is such a large part of the game and isn't enjoyable on the level I want it to be, then eventually, I'm just going to be thinking, why am I not playing something else? Why am I not playing Bayonetta? Or even, why am I not playing something like, the Souls series, which the combat isn't, I've said before, the combat isn't at the depth of something like a pure action game, but it is at least enjoyable to play in a way that I think maybe the Witcher games aren't. I feel like I'm digging myself into a deeper hole here by bringing The Witcher up again. But hopefully everybody understands where I'm coming from. I think that, anyway, I'm talking about the commenter here, and their point was that these things subtract from the game rather than add to them. So it's not just that they're not a gain, it's that they actually subtract. And I think that was a very good, valid, interesting point, which maybe got to the core of the issue better than I did. Somebody else mentioned that they talked about the budgets of games, and they said that Japanese games tend to have smaller, but like they were saying that it's not really an issue about Japanese versus Western, it's more about smaller budget and bigger budget games. And the perfect example that they gave was Final Fantasy 15. Final Fantasy 15, obviously a very big budget game, and because of that, it has those same sort of qualities that I described last time around when I was talking about Western games, where it wants to do a bunch of different things. And because of that, from what I've played of it, it just doesn't do those things well, and I don't really enjoy it. So I played the demo of it. I can't remember the name of the demo, but you start like miniaturized or something. I don't know why it was like that. Come to think of it, it's like a Kingdom Hearts scenario or something where you were tiny and there was these big toy blocks. Oh, it was a dream. Yeah, it's a dream sequence. Okay, I remember now. Right. That was very strange in my mind until I remember that. Okay, yeah. So it was a dream sequence where, you're in this little room and there's toy blocks and stuff around. And it allowed you to sample the combat, and the combat just wasn't good. I just don't think it's good. It didn't even like, if we ignore the actual depth of it, I'm not even going to say how much depth there was to it because I don't know. But even just like the feel of it, if it was the deepest game ever, I probably still wouldn't play it because it just didn't feel good. The hits didn't feel like they connected, and it was all very flowy and blah blah blah. And I didn't like it. And it's just a great example of me of, I would rather have a good turn-based system than a bad action system, because a good turn-based system is something I don't get anywhere else. Like as a great example, Persona 5 it's not the deepest game ever made. It's not as even the combat itself isn't as deep as some of the mainline Shin Megami Tensei games like Nocturne or whatever. I think the press turn system in those games is better than the one Persona uses for general combat anyway. But it's just kind of like, it's enjoyable. Like, it might not be the greatest thing ever, but it's enjoyable, and especially in Persona 5, I think it's probably one of the best turn-based action systems ever, just in terms of actually feeling good. Like, the way they, what they did with the menu in it is brilliant. The way it's just one button press to get to any action that you want and stuff like that. So, that's a great example of, I'd just rather play a good turn-based one than a poor action one, because if I'm playing a poor action game, I would be thinking, why am I not playing a better action game? Just like what I said about The Witcher a minute ago. But I'm kind of getting off topic here. My point anyway, or the point this person was making, was that it's about budgets, and they were saying that Final Fantasy 15 isn't a very good game. Again, I haven't played it, but the reason I haven't played it is because I don't think I would enjoy it. Based on the demo, I gave the demo a go and I didn't enjoy it, and everything I've seen about the game tells me that I'm probably not going to enjoy it, so I haven't played it. This is a whole other thing I could get into, but sometimes I feel like one of the few people who actually does that, avoids games that they don't think they're going to enjoy. Maybe I'll come back to that in a minute. Anyway, so the budget thing, I think it was a very interesting point. I think it was totally on point. But I think the agreement that we kind of came to after a little bit of discussion, and maybe they felt this way all along, but anyway, it crystallized in my mind is that, if Japanese games tend to have smaller budgets, which I think they do, and if Western games tend to have bigger budgets, which I think they do, then that is actually a difference between Japanese and Western games. So it's could be that the budget is the underlying thing, but that it still actually makes up the difference between the Japanese and Western design that we see. So that was very interesting. That was a good point. And lastly, my favorite comment of them all. I'm not going to read it all because it was very long. But this was a very interesting comment, and I'm going to read the entire first paragraph of it because I think it was a very interesting point. So yeah, I'll just read it. This person said, I definitely agree with Japanese games being more skewed. Here's an observation of mine which ties into that. I think Japanese stuff tends to be more systematic and less naturalistic. Japanese games tend to not value naturalism as much. I was thinking about this to myself for a while, and then I read an interview with a sound director for Capcom, Tomoya Kishi, which solidified the idea for me more. He talked about the difference in sounds of Western games and Japanese games and used footsteps as an example. He said typically Japanese games may only have 2 footstep sounds per ground material. The reason, he said, was that Japanese people expect a symbolic representation of sounds for footsteps. They expect a left, right, clip, clop pattern. In Western games, however, usually many more footstep sounds per material are used in an attempt to mask the game's artificial nature. Kishi also said he felt that Japanese games tried to make the player hear individual sounds more, whereas Western games focused more on the soundscapes as a whole, making sure no sound stood out in particular. In my opinion, it's because if something stands out, it breaks the naturalism, which I think many developers equate with immersion. And then the commenter says, I don't at all, personally. So they had a whole other bunch of stuff in here, but I think that really cut to the core. I think that really represented the core of their point there. And it's very interesting. I'm not really sure I have anything else to add to it. But, it must have some weight. I mean, it comes from a Japanese sound director at Capcom. So, I'm sure that they have thought about this problem or this difference quite deeply anyway. And there you go. That's an interesting take on it. I don't know if it accounts for everything, all the differences, that we might read into the Japanese East-West sort of thing. But yeah, it was a very, very interesting point and not something I'd heard before. So I wanted to bring that up. Before I move on, I did have that thing I brought up a second ago where I tend to avoid games I don't think I'm going to enjoy. And I just wanted to touch on that a little bit, even though it's a personal issue. I get asked this a lot. Like I get asked, well, not so much anymore about this game, but like the DMC reboot, D lowercase M C, the Devil May Cry reboot. People ask me what my opinion on that was, and the answer is that I don't have one because I saw the footage of it and I didn't think I was going to enjoy it, so I didn't play it. And hopefully, even though I've some of my more popular videos are would go to the contrary, hopefully I have not given you the impression that I'm some kind of outrage merchant or something like that. I don't play games that I don't think I'm going to enjoy, and I'm not offended by people asking me, or the assumption that I would have played those games, because I don't think there's anything wrong with playing those games. Even if you just want to see that they are bad, I have no idea if the DMC reboot is actually bad or not. I have no idea if Other M is actually bad or not. I just didn't play them because I wouldn't bet on them being good. I'm not betting the money when you make when you make the purchase, buy the game, you're kind of making the bet that it is going to be good, and I'm not willing to make the bet on those games. So that's kind of the point that I'm making. I just find it interesting, and I just think it's not something I've brought up before. I'm not sure when I would get the chance to bring it up, so I wanted to bring it up and just say, don't play games you don't think you're going to enjoy. Go out of your comfort zone and play things you're not sure about. But if you look at a game and you think, that looks like absolute shit, I'm not playing it, it looks like an insult. Like, if you were a Devil May Cry fan, you knew this about the DMC reboot just by watching a trailer of it, You knew it didn't look good. You knew that Dante looked stupid and the gameplay didn't really look all that great and all. You knew it. You knew that you probably weren't going to enjoy a significant chunk of that game. And I just find it interesting that people will, if they're asking me about this, presumably they've played it themselves and they want to know, or they know that a bunch of other people have played these games. And so I think it's something that I just kind of tangentially touched upon there. But I would encourage you to play games that you're not sure about, but don't go out of your way to play games that you think you're going to hate just so you can prove to everybody that you hate them for the right reasons. I think that is a complete waste of time. So I just wanted to, while I have the platform here, I just wanted to discourage everybody from wasting their time on stuff like that. Life is way too short. Alright, so we're going to actually get into the questions now. So I asked again for games related questions because it's the kind of stuff I prefer to talk about. And I think I will stretch the definition a little bit by having a few slightly more personal or slightly more industry related questions. But for the most part, we're going to be talking about actual games themselves again. Alright, so here we go. Question 1. Would you agree that Platinum not forcing players to play their games the quote-unquote right way is a design flaw? Shouldn't a game strive to give all players the same intended experience? I understand that a lot of the appeal of Platinum games is to complete it multiple times until you understand its mechanics, but I always found that to be an excuse for Platinum's lack of focus. Is it really okay for the majority of people to leave Bayonetta with stone awards? If you haven't played Bayonetta, you should know that the Stone Award is basically the worst award you can get in the game after you've finished a level. If you've done poorly, you'll get a Stone Award. And generally on your first playthrough, you'll get a ton of Stone Awards because the game is judging you against the standard of somebody who is actually more familiar with the game. So the first part of this that I wanted to address is the second question there. Shouldn't a game strive to give all players the same intended experience? And I think my answer to that is unequivocally no. I think that there are some games where the entire point of the game is to give people different experiences if that's what they want. So the quintessential example there would be Deus Ex. Deus Ex is, the whole design philosophy was to give people multiple ways of approaching things. You can do non-lethal or a passive, or you can crawl through an air vent, or you can talk to somebody or whatever. And there's obviously several other games that take that sort of approach where you have more freedom. Now, For when it comes to action games, I think that the answer is still no, but it's a less harsh or a less, I don't know, serious no. It's sort of a less severe no. It's sort of edging into maybe territory, you know. But I still think that the answer is no for that one. A good example would be something like Devil May Cry 3. You can use the Style Switcher mod now on the PC version, but the actual core game itself has different styles where the player has to pick one or the other. You know, you can't do both. So you can obviously change style partway through the game when you get to the statues. You can change the style, but for a certain combat encounter or a certain level or certain parts of the game, you're going to have to use one style or the other. You can't do both at the same time. So in that case, even though it's just a pure action game, just a straight up pure action game, it is giving players a different way to play, slightly different, not hugely different. You know, Dante's moveset is still largely the same across all the different styles, but it's not exactly the same intended experience for every encounter. So even that, as an example, would be a no. And some people would say that Devil May Cry 3 is the best action game ever made, you know? So that would be a no on that front as well, I think. The other part that I want to address is also is it really okay for the majority of people to leave Bayonetta with stone awards? I don't know if this is what you meant or if you meant to imply this at all. I could be just reading a bit too much into this, but the way this question sort of comes after everything else kind of implies that it's Platinum's fault that people leave Bayonetta with stone awards. I do think that that's true to some extent. Obviously, you know, it's partly the game's fault, quote unquote, for giving the player stone awards on their first playthrough and all that sort of stuff. But the player has to take a certain amount of responsibility for that as well, of course. Personally, you know, when I reviewed The Wonderful 101, you know, I hadn't been playing those types of action games quite as much. In the previous years, I hadn't been playing those types of action games, which I've been playing lots of other things instead, you know. And you know the way sometimes you kind of rotate through genres or whatever. You know, you go on your RPG kick and you go on your different kick. And I have a lot of different kicks, and so it'd been a while since I'd actually gotten really into an action game in that way, a long time. But when I played it several times. And you know, before I reviewed it, I played it like 4 times, I think I say in my video. And so then I came to understand the game more deeply because of that. So, you know, it was totally my responsibility to do that, to understand that that was the game, you know, the way the game was supposed to be played. It was supposed to be played over and over. I think that's obvious. I think it should be obvious to most people, but I don't know if it is or not. And, you know, it's a problem with reviewers who didn't play it over and over again. I posted this screenshot on my Twitter a long time ago of it was some review. I can't remember what review it was, but basically it was a picture of this is the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. It was a picture of Unite Guts, which is your basic defensive move, reflecting a projectile, and underneath it the reviewer had put a caption, "I didn't find this particular ability to be very useful." Right? And it's like, yeah, I think I have a question about this later about objectivity, but it's like I would be the first person to say that my reviews are subjective, and as are all reviews, but some things are a bit more subjective than others, if you know what I mean. It's like that is about as close, or you know, it is basically a false statement to say that that ability isn't useful. You know, it's essentially false. I think when it comes to games, there are things that are falsifiable in a way that isn't true maybe of other mediums, you know. But I'm kind of skipping ahead on my questions there. But anyway, you know, that is really the core of the problem there, is that the reviewer didn't put the time in. You know, it's not really the game's fault that he didn't do that. It's that he didn't bother to try to understand it properly, you know. And I sympathize with reviewers. For example, they don't have the freedom that I have, where I can go and play a game for a month and then come back and do a review on it then after that point, or even, you know, like I'm doing with Breath of the Wild right now, where I've played it, I've completed it, but there's no review. Why is that? Is it because I don't want to do it? Of course not. It's in my best interest to do a Breath of the Wild review as soon after the game comes out as possible. But the point is that I'm giving the game, kind of a pun here, but space to breathe, right? It needs space to breathe. I need to come back to it again later and see how I feel about it later after I've had more time to think about it. And I think that's the only fair way to really get into something like that. And that's why you probably won't see me doing reviews on games that have just come out again anytime soon. I do think that not only is it important to give a game more time in terms of playtime, but also more time in terms of actual physical time spent since you've played it the first time to come back with it with fresh eyes. But anyway, I think that it is definitely part of the player's responsibility is to understand how those games want to be played. Which again, I don't think it's difficult to understand that they, the awards basically tell you try again, try again, get a better score. It's the way a lot of other games were built, like arcade games. Nobody would go up to a Pac-Man cabinet, play once, die, never play it again, and do a full review on the game. Nobody would ever do that because it's dumb, right? The game obviously just doesn't want to be played that way. And I think that the same is true for the most of Platinum's games. It's just maybe a bit less obvious than it is with something like Pac-Man. But anyway, I'll give you a perfect example of somebody who made it there, like to show you how it's not the game's fault entirely, right? And it couldn't ever be the game's fault entirely. I have a friend of mine who doesn't really play action games, and he only owns Nintendo consoles, right? And I want to be clear, he doesn't play action games, right? Like at all, okay? I mean, he hasn't played Devil May Cry, he hasn't played Bayonetta, he hasn't played, Revengeance, anything like anything. I think maybe he played a little bit of Beautiful Joe a decade ago, right? But he only owns Nintendo consoles. He doesn't play many games in general, right? But because I spoke so highly of the Wonderful 101, he got it for himself. He played it. He actually played it to completion. And he told me when he was playing it, oh yeah, I've been playing the level, and when I get to the end, it gives me the little consolation prize, which is the Wonderful 101 equivalent of the Stone Award. So what does he do? Goes back and plays the entire level again until he doesn't get that. So as long as he didn't get a consolation prize, he was happy to move on. So he actually played good chunks of that whole first playthrough. I mean, I think he kind of moved on a little bit towards the end. He just started, finishing it. But for good chunks of that entire playthrough, he went back and played a mission again when he got a consolation prize. And I think that that's a totally valid and interesting and maybe even the best way to play those games. Personally, I would say to just play through it once and not really care. But it's totally, if you get more enjoyment of the game going back and trying not to get a consolation prize, then more power to you. And it goes to show how the player is responsible for that ultimately at the end of the day, because they can go back and they can replay as much as they like. And I'm sure when he finished, there's still a lot, because it's a complex game, there's still a lot about the game he didn't know when he was finished it. But I'm sure compared to somebody who just blasted through the game in one go, he understood and appreciated the game a bit better than, somebody who just got consolation prize on every level. I'm sure he understood things about the game. Like, for example, he would never have made that picture about Unite Guts, right? Because he would understand the value of that. Because you basically can't beat the first mission without a consolation prize, without, at least deflecting a few attacks, So, I do think that's the onus rests on the player just as much as the game, if not more. God, I talked way longer about that than I intended to. I considered the real meat of this question to be the first part, actually. Would you agree that Platinum not forcing players to play their games the right way is a design flaw? And again, and I'm sorry to give you a hat trick here, but I'm going to have to say no. And the reason, I do think that it can be a problem, but I wouldn't say it's a flaw. So I need to kind of differentiate in my head and explain what I mean by that, and hopefully you'll understand. So one of the reasons, this is perfect. Yeah, we're kind of leading on here. So one of the reasons why that review, I'm sorry to pick on this reviewer so much because I don't know, I can't even remember who it was, and maybe he's reviewed loads of other games really well. But for this Wonderful 101 review, he was clearly off point. But anyway, that reviewer, the reason he was able to, not understand the value of Unite Guts was because the Wonderful 101 has a very lenient continue system. It has probably the most lenient continue system I've ever seen. And Bayonetta has quite a lenient continue system as well. In Bayonetta, if you die, you just have to redo the combat at the start of the combat encounter you're on, which is usually just, a few seconds ago. If you're on a boss, it could be a bit longer, but you're really just getting teleported a few seconds back into the past, essentially. In the Wonderful 101 has about the most lenient continue system you could ever imagine, where uh, when you die, you pick up exactly where you left off. So if you continue in the middle of a boss fight, the boss is still on half health or whatever. So it's basically, if you're willing to just continue whenever you get the prompt, it's impossible not to complete the Wonderful 101, right? Or as close to impossible as it can be, because you can just chip an enemy down over a million continues, right? If you're really that bad, you can use a million continues, hit an enemy once in between every continue, and continue playing the game. At least I think that you can do that, right? Anyway, I don't think there's any limit on the number of continues. But anyway, the point is, it's extremely lenient, and that's why reviewers didn't really have to understand it to complete it, and they didn't gain as much appreciation as they could have. I say reviewers here. I don't mean to pick on reviewers. I mean people in general. Reviewers are the ones that we see. Reviewers are the ones that they have to post their opinion and they have to explain their opinion, so we see, oh, he didn't understand how Unite Guts worked or how valuable it was. Therefore, his understanding of the game was minuscule, because that's really just the first step of the game. Whereas you can imagine loads of other people, like commenters who say, oh, I played this game and it wasn't very good, blah blah blah. They could have the exact same problems and you'll never know. So there's so many people who have played the Wonderful 101 had the exact same problems, and we'll never know. They'll shit talk the game and say it wasn't very good, but because they don't actually reveal their knowledge about the game, we have no way of knowing whether to value that opinion or not. And then there's a whole silent majority of people who have played it, and loads of them won't have enjoyed it on the level that they could have. And it's the same problem there, and we'll never know, and they'll never know. I think that's the worst part, is that they'll never know how they could have improved their enjoyment of the game. That's the really sad part for me, anyway. But anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, yeah. So the the problem with this is that I wouldn't say it's a flaw. In terms of actual game design, I wouldn't say it's a flaw, even in the Wonderful 101. Okay, now I will be the first person to say that I prefer a system like Beautiful Joe that actually punishes you really harshly for using a continue. In Beautiful Joe, you go back to the start of the level or the halfway point of the level, and there's no in-betweens, and that's it, right? So you can lose about 15 minutes of game time for playing poorly, and I like that, personally. I like that. But, well, it depends on the game, like if the game is completely fair in the way that I think something like Beautiful Joe is, then I like it, because, the punishment feels rewarded. What was I going to say? That it's well deserved, right? The punishment seems well deserved. Anyway, so in the Wonderful 101, you continue from wherever you left off, and because of that, I think that's a large contributing factor as to why their games tend to get overlooked more than they should be. If people were forced to understand them, then they would get more praise, I think, because you would gain more enjoyment when you understand all the systems in Bayonetta or the Wonderful 101 or whatever. You get more enjoyment out of it. It's just true. There's more there for you to grab onto and really dig into and enjoy. So I think it causes their games to be overlooked, and I do think that's a problem. Okay, it's something that maybe they should consider not doing. They should maybe consider actually making the continue systems in their games worse, right? I mean, harsher. Not when I say worse, I mean harsher. Okay, but I still wouldn't say it's actually a flaw with the game, because in the game, when you use a continue, you lose an entire rank on your score at the end of the level, and the score is really what you're playing for. You're playing to see how good a reward you can get at the end of the mission. And you even kind of admit to that in your question as well. Is it really okay for the majority of people to leave Bayonetta with stone awards? I think if you're frustrated by this, it's because playing the game and getting a stone award is a bad thing. It's not something you should be doing. It's something you should be trying to avoid. And so when you use a continue, you are punished really harshly in that sense. You level down an entire level on your score. Whatever your score was, if it was pure platinum, it's platinum. If it's, well, it can't be pure platinum at that point, but anyway, if it's platinum, it's gold. If it's gold, it's silver. If it's silver, it's bronze. If it's bronze, it's a consolation prize now. That's pretty harsh, especially when you use 2 or 3 of them. Once you've used 2 or 3 of them, you are practically guaranteed to get a consolation prize at the end of the mission, or a stone award, or whatever. So I think that considering the way the game is designed and what the game is actually trying to achieve, the continue system works perfectly fine. But the problem is that it doesn't force people to appreciate their games on the level that they should be. And so I would say that it is a problem. It is something that they could enhance, but I also think that it's not actually a flaw with the game when you consider what the game is trying to achieve. So I don't know if I explained that very well, but I feel like I've dedicated a lot of time to it, so I really hope that I have. Maybe if we're going to get comments on this one, I would like at least one or two people to tell me whether or not I explained that, because if I haven't, I think maybe I would like to bring it up again at some point. But it's yeah, I'll just reiterate what I said. It's not, I don't think it's actually a flaw with the game itself. I think it's a flaw with how people consume the games more than the games. So that was quite a long one on that one. Okay. We're going to be here for a few hours. People probably wouldn't care if I just spent ages talking about that. Actually, one of the comments on the last thing was saying that I should spend more time on questions. So there you go. You're probably happy with that one. Right. Whew. Right. So we're going to be here for a few hours if I actually answer all the questions that I have. So I might have to cut a few questions, but we'll see anyway. Next question. What do you think the game industry needs to address the most, and what do you think gets addressed too much when it should be taking a backseat to other issues, whether it be graphics, performance, playstyle, sequels, social issues, etc.? For me, the big one is and has always been graphics is too much of a of an emphasis on pretty much every game. Well, no, actually that's way too harsh. On a lot of games, a lot of AAA games, the graphics are just too much of an emphasis. I've been thinking about this question a little bit since before I started the podcast, and I think one thing that I really like about Nintendo from the Wii onwards is the fact that they do have underpowered hardware. Most people complain about this. Most people really complain about the fact that Nintendo isn't giving us the cutting edge stuff. And I've pushed back on this before, and the way I've pushed back, for example, well, a very recent example is Sonic Mania came out, and I bought it on the Switch, because why wouldn't I? You know, my choices at the moment for buying Sonic Mania were the PS4, which means I can play it on my TV, the PC, which means the benefit the PC would have for me is that the account system is better. Like, I'm more confident that 10 years from now I'll be able to download Sonic Mania again on Steam, although we'll get into Steam a little bit in a while, or at least into Valve a little bit. But yeah, so the that's the benefit for me, is that I believe in that account system. Like, Steam seems more stable to me, or at least it feels more real than the Nintendo account system, you know what I mean? Or even the Sony one. Because, even across the PS3 and the PS4, there's a bunch of games that I owned on the PS3 that I still can't play on the PS4, even just digital games, And some of them weren't very good, they were just, but that doesn't mean that I shouldn't be able to play them. Obviously, the whole problem is that the architecture changed so drastically between consoles that, everything has to be reported again. And hopefully that won't be the case with the PS5 or whatever comes out next. But I don't know for sure. I don't know for sure whether that's going to be the case. So I can either buy it on the PS4. PS4 is looking less appealing now, because firstly, I don't know if I'll be able to play it on the next console. I presume I will, but I don't know for sure. Whereas, Steam doesn't really have that issue. And also, I can only play it on the TV, which isn't true for the Switch. I can play it on, my handheld. Sorry, I know this doesn't really sound related to your question, but I'll get around to it in a second, but just trust me. So anyway, I bought Sonic Mania on the Switch, and I'm really glad that I did, because graphically, it looks like it's an indie game. This is the thing where I think the Switch is going to prevail. And one reason I really wish Nintendo had a better account system, because if they had an account system I could really believe in, they would be the best choice by far. But basically, I'm really glad that I bought it on the Switch, because I can play it in bed, I can play it on the couch, To me, it's just really cool to be able to play a new Sonic game on the handheld like that, and I lose nothing. I lose absolutely nothing compared to the PS4 version. I lose, graphically it looks exactly the same. It's 1080p. I mean, maybe the PS4 Pro is 4K. I think actually I did hear that. maybe it's, I don't know, does it matter really? Like it looks basically identical across both versions of the thing. I think there was some slight frame rate dips in the special stages or something. God forbid it dips to 55 FPS or something like that. So it's it's essentially the same thing, except now I can play it on the go. And like, I go elsewhere to record the audio for my videos, which is why this sounds different. So I can, next time I do that, I can take it with me, play Sonic Mania on the bus or whatever. And there you go, or play it when I'm there and I'm just hanging out. It's just it's by far the best way to play that game, right? So I've talked a little bit in the past about uh, how Nintendo offers this sort of gimmick to people. So they didn't capitalize on it very well with the Wii U, but they've got the tablet, and the tablet plus TV gameplay is something you can't get anywhere else, right? I'll be the first person to admit they didn't really capitalize on it as much as they could have. But even something like the Wind Waker, like the inventory system on the thing was good. It was cool, like the way you could just swap items like that straight away, and even just a small benefit like that, you can't get that on other platforms. It just doesn't exist, even on the PC, the most moddable platform of them all. You could technically get some program where you hook up a tablet to your PC and you can play that way, but of course no games actually take advantage of it, which you could probably say of the Wii U, but anyway. Yeah, so the point is they offer you this gimmick that you can't get elsewhere, and I think that's valuable in terms of hardware, and I think it helps to make it more valuable in my eyes than something like the PS4. And I feel like I'm running against the grain on that one, which I think is sad. I think a lot of people really dwell on Nintendo's graphical capabilities, and this is the point I really want to make, is that of course the gimmick itself is useful. Like with Sonic Mania, the gimmick itself is nice. I can pick it up and I can go and play it anywhere. Something like Breath of the Wild, I'm probably not going to play that on a bus or something. It's not really the type of game that benefits from that. And even I found I don't really like playing it in the handheld mode either. I don't think it really gives me the same experience as the full TV, which actually I would have said that handhelds and TVs aren't all that different from each other not so long ago. I would have said that it's, if the screen is the same resolution and you're looking at it at a distance, that makes it more or less the same. What's really the difference? But I do actually feel like there kind of is a difference when I'm playing it on the TV. But anyway, let's not dwell on that too much. But the point is, they offer you this gimmick, and then the graphics suffer for it. So because the Switch is portable, it can't have graphics on par with the PS4 or something like that. Now, I actually think to some degree, it is a good thing. It's a good thing that the Switch can't output graphics on the level of the PS4. And I actually think, again, it's a good thing with the Wii and a good thing with the Wii U that they weren't graphically up to par with those other consoles. So why do I think that? Well, because it forces developers to focus on something else. It really is that simple. Because Nintendo knows, if they're going to make like a new Metroid, right? And they are. Now the new Metroid will probably look pretty nice. Like the Metroid Prime games looked nice. They had a lot of cool little details in them. But Nintendo knows that they cannot coast on the quality of the graphics for the new Metroid game. It's not possible. It's just not possible to do that. Because whatever they do, even, not quite top range PS4 games will still look better. And then you compare it to something like the Naughty Dogs of the world, which are just going to look incredibly detailed compared to something that you get on the Switch, So they know they can't compete on that level, which means they have to focus on the other elements of the game. And I think that is actually a benefit to the console. I think it has been a benefit to them since the Wii, which isn't to say that it's unequivocally a good thing. I like to see games with nice graphics, from time to time. I just think that developers focus on it to the detriment of other things too much. And yeah, I've thought a little bit about doing an actual full-fledged video on this topic, but I tend to avoid topics that are too broad for, I don't know, some reasons that maybe I'll get into at a different point. But anyway, I still think I could possibly do a video on that at some point. I know just by saying this, people are going to say, they'd like to see a video on that, but, doing a video on one thing is necessarily not doing a video on something else. And anyway, I'm getting off topic a little bit. So I think that graphics are too big a focus. And basically, the problem is when you push more graphics to the screen, other things necessarily suffer. Not to, it's not entirely a zero sum game, but it is a little bit. It is the type of thing where the more graphical fidelity you have, the harder it is to make the game in the first place. Maybe that's even the biggest problem. It's just that making the assets for the game increases the budget to a huge degree and costs more time and stuff like that. Um, so I think that graphics have been too big a focus, and I find and this is a much more subjective point, is that again, I don't want to imply that a certain objectivity to what I was saying before. Just that I think maybe there is more degrees of subjectivity than just. I think maybe it's not just quite a binary 1-0 thing. But anyway, um, yeah, the thing subjectively I would say is that I'm nearly 30 now. Shock horror. So I'm still quite young, but I'm advancing in age, right? And I've been around for a while, and I've seen a lot of games, and personally, the level that graphics are at now, and I feel like this is less to do with the actual level that graphics are at, and more just to. I do think it is one of those things where it's just you hit a certain point in life where you've grown through so many graphical changes, and I've felt this way for a while actually. I think maybe we hit it with the PS3 with me, but anyway, I think you hit a certain point where you've grown through so many graphical changes that you just don't really care anymore. When I started playing games, the Mega Drive was the first console that I had. It was my brother's actually, but anyway, the Mega Drive was the first console I would play on regularly. But like even then, I would have played NES games quite a lot in friends' houses and stuff like that. So I've gone from the NES all the way up now to the PS4, and the PS4 Pro and the Xbox One X that are coming out. The graphical leap from the NES to the PS4 is just so insanely huge. It's mind-boggling, and I think I could. I don't know if it's just a subjective thing or not. And again, I suppose I'd be interested to hear comments on this one as well. I don't want to call for too many comments or anything like that, but because I'm not sure if I'll read them all. But the point is, like, it's hit a point now with the PS4 where even kind of a bad, mediocre looking PS4 game still looks really good to me. It still looks to the point where just like I don't really care about it looking any better anymore. And I think that maybe that's one of the worst things I could say as a reviewer. And if I'm reviewing a game, obviously I will get more into a mentality that, games should, if they're not going to push graphics, they should do other things that are going to do, make up for that. Or if they are going to push graphics, they should do it in the best way they can. Like I'm not really wearing my reviewer hat right now, but just talking as a person, just as a regular person. I'm not really sure I care. I will see comments on something saying like, oh, this game, oh, the graphics are like, especially on Switch games and stuff like that. People will be picking apart Splatoon 2 and going, oh, look, the texture filtering here, it's not quite, I can kind of see where the filtering is happening, and it's just, oh, it's kind of ugly looking, isn't it? And I'm just thinking, no, not really. Like, no, it looks fine. It just looks perfectly fine to me. Like, it's a perfectly fine looking game. Uh, and like I'm not somebody who really cares about the push to 4K. Obviously I think we're gonna go down that route eventually, but I don't really care. Maybe it's the kind of thing 4K will happen, and I'll look back and 1080p will look like a blurry mess. And I'll go, okay, I'm glad we have 4K now. And I do want to. At some point, I was actually hoping to build a new PC to play Scalebound at full whack, but that's not happening. But at some point, I hope to build a new PC in the next year or two, if I can. And I would like to get a 4K monitor for it and play games in 4K. I'm not against that sort of thing. I just think that the push on it is just so extreme. I'm not really sure we need to be pushing 4K right now. It seems a little bit, much. So, yeah, I'm not sure I answered that question in as analytical a way as I could have, but the graphics would be too big a focus. And then just to briefly touch on the other side of it, I think that something that happens too much is too many sequels. Just too many sequels happening. And I feel like that is especially, I think I mentioned this on one of my E3 streams, I think it's an especially big problem in the generation that just happened with the PS4, where, it used to be that all these developers would go off and make something new when a new generation came. Right at the start of the PS3, Xbox 360, Wii life cycle, you got a whole bunch of new IPs from people, like Gears of War and Uncharted and Infamous and I'm trying to think what else. Resistance, yeah. But you know, now we're still playing Gears of War, and we're still playing Uncharted, we're still playing Ratchet and Clank, we're still playing Infamous. Uh, we're still playing Halo, we're still playing all these things, and I feel like more would be gained by moving on from those properties at this point. I'm not sure they're doing or saying anything new anymore, you know. So I think that that's a big problem and has been a big problem for the last 5 years, 4 or 5 years in particular. Um, yeah, too many sequels, too many sequels. Okay, so next question. Do you consider the game has aged a real criticism? The reason I ask is that, for example, a game like Resident Evil, which had criticisms of its fixed camera and controls when it was first released, not sure I read that correctly. Then I'm going to read it again. The reason I ask is that, for example, a game like Resident Evil, which had criticisms of its fixed camera and controls when it was released, some people trying them today level those same criticisms at it, but add that those aspects have aged. I just to answer the start of the question, I don't think that it's a real criticism. No, it's kind of one of those nothing terms that has come up quite a lot on the Ask FM page. So at this point, there's something like 800 answered questions on there. So I know it's a pain in the ass to read them all. I would encourage people, if you have the patience or if you really like hearing what I have to say about things, which, statistically, we're in a biased selection of people here if you're listening to this podcast. So maybe it's true of you. If you really want to hear what I have to say, then it can be worth scrolling through all the joke answers to get to the good stuff on that. But anyway, it has come up a lot, so people talk about stuff like atmosphere and immersion and stuff like that, and do they actually mean anything? And a lot of the time the answer is no. And I even, in the last podcast, I kind of talked about it, some people would consider to be people would say dismiss something like atmosphere or immersion and say that it's not really a game related term, or it's kind of wishy-washy sort of thing, but then go on and say something like depth is perfectly fine because it relates to gameplay. There's that whole gameplay non-gameplay dichotomy, and some people treat one side of that spectrum a lot more seriously than the other, which I think is unfair. But anyway, I would also say the same of the word depth, which I did last time, is that it doesn't really mean anything by itself. And if you want my thoughts on that, you can go back and listen to that. It's the first question on the previous podcast. But anyway, so I would say the same is true of a lot of phrases and a lot of terms, and that if you want them to mean anything, you kind of have to provide some meaningful context or something like that to it. It's language is not so simple as you can just say a word and it means loads of things at once. But the game has aged. I don't really think it means anything. If I've said this myself, I apologize. If I've said that a game has aged, I apologize, because I don't think it's a good phrase. But I understand why people resort to it. I think what they really mean, and what I would mean if I said it, is that the game as it is now, it doesn't really stand up to the design standards that are prevalent today, right? I think that's what people really mean. So in that sense, you could say that Resident Evil has aged. Obviously, objectively, it hasn't aged because games don't age in the way that people do. You can go on PSN or whatever, or fire up a less legal option, and you can play the original Resident Evil with a controller that's very much like the controller that was back then, and it's basically exactly the same thing that it was back then. It's exactly the same experience. But I think that what they mean is that the design standards have changed. Some things have fallen out of fashion. People now think that they're bad design, and I think that's a very dangerous and bad way to think. And I touched a little bit upon it in my Devil May Cry video, and I'm not even going to defend the tank controls in Resident Evil entirely. I'm not. But I did touch upon in my Devil May Cry video that there actually is some advantages to it. People kind of talk about them as though they're this completely objectively bad, shitty thing that nobody should ever do anymore. But I do think that there are benefits to it. And I think that something like Resident Evil 4, I don't really care that it has tank controls because it's a good game, And maybe it would be a worse game if it didn't have those controls. Or something like God Hand. God Hand, again, we're seeing a pattern here with Mikami's games. But anyway, God Hand has tank controls, but it works. It works because it's, first of all, it's using the right analog stick for something else. So, you can't really use that to move the character. And that's a really good excuse why the game has to have tank controls. But anyway, Um, again, I wouldn't be the person to say that God Hand is flawless. I think that people maybe sometimes gloss over God Hand's flaws. The pendulum swings the other way because some people love God Hand so much. They try and spin everything as a positive. Where I think that the tank controls are kind of necessary for it to work, but the camera, it's not your friend. It's not your friend in that game. But anyway, so I don't think it's an objectively bad thing, and I think that just because it's fallen out of favor doesn't mean it's bad. But some people kind of think that way. They've only played games in another sense, and they can't get used to anything that isn't like that. I know what you mean as well about some people saying that they're doing the same criticisms but saying that those aspects have aged. I think this is just the problem with people who didn't play the game at the time. Again, I hope I'm not guilty of this. I don't think I am actually of this one. I might have said that a game has aged at some point, but I don't think I'm guilty of this one. But it's kind of hard to blame them for it. I mean, it's not a good thing to do. But I think they're just trying to speculate on what people felt about the game at the time. But I do remember, because I played Resident Evil right when it came out. Now, I was only young, but I do remember that the controls felt kind of clunky and weird. And it's not hard to see why when you compare it to other PS1 games. Like the other PS1 games I would have been playing were things like Wipeout. Wipeout controls perfectly fine. An analog stick would have been good. Maybe Wipeout 3 has analog control, I'm not sure, but it feels like a perfectly fine game, because it's a racing game, so the controls hold up perfectly fine. Something like Crash Bandicoot, again, analog controls might have been better. I know you can use an analog stick in 2 and 3, but I'm not sure, I don't think Crash actually has any analog level to his movement. I think it's a digital sort of movement, But again, it wasn't tank controls. The game, other platformers did use tank controls like Croc or something, and Croc is a worse game for it. It's not good. It's not as good as Crash Bandicoot, not by a long shot. And something like Croc, but Crash, yeah, the controls could have been a little bit better, but it's perfectly fine because the game was built with the control scheme in mind. It's quite linear, and you're not really expected to do too much 3D movement at any particular time. And you've got something like Cooler World, which I touched upon in my video. The controls now are good. They feel just as good now as they did back then. Obviously, because we've said that games objectively don't age. They are the same piece of media now as they were back then. But like the controls just feel they make sense. It's like this is the way Cooler World should play. And actually, I believe it was made by some of the same people. There's a game you can play on Steam called Puzzle Dimension. Which is very similar to Cooler World. It is a ball moving around on tiles. It's a little bit different. I haven't played that much of it myself. And the controls are actually very similar. I actually think that Cooler World has better controls, personally. Just it's kind of more finicky in a way, but it's also more straightforward in a way. You can strafe in Puzzle Dimension, and I'm not really... I know I said that maybe you should be able to do that in the Cooler World video, and it's the kind of thing that I hope I could get used to, but anyway... But yeah, they control about the same. Like it's this digital sort of movement where you're just moving forward one tile at a time, and it controls perfectly fine. Whereas even back then with Resident Evil, you'd get yourself into an awkward position with the camera and you wouldn't know what was going on. And I think that the problem is less with the controls and more with the camera, where they set up these sort of artistic camera angles which looked really cool, but also were kind of disorientating sometimes. So yeah, I don't think it's a real criticism. I don't think that game's age. I don't think it really says anything. I think you need to expand upon it more if you're going to talk about how a game compares now to what it was doing back then. And I think if a game is good, it holds up, then it's not probably not going to feel that way, for the most part. But some games do seem a little bit strange by modern standards, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing all the time. And I think that's one reason why it can be valuable to go back and see. Like there's some people really like the tank controls in Resident Evil because they really like the camera of Resident Evil. Some people hate the camera, but some people love the camera because it's got this nice tension to it, and it does look good in a way that a lot of games don't. Like it can present you these artistic angles that you can't see in other games a lot of time. I think, for example, I've had this point in my head about Killer 7 if I was ever going to do a Killer 7 video, so you can have a preview of that if that was ever to happen. But like Killer 7 looks good in a way that a lot of games don't because of the movement system. The movement system is weird. It's just you move along a rail, you know? It's very strange, but it's I don't even want to describe it. It's kind of a bit like tank controls except on a rail, and yeah, it seems very much like an evolution of Resident Evil, which shouldn't be surprising considering Mikami was a producer on it. He probably gave some feedback there, and it's very much styled in a Resident Evil sort of way in a lot of ways. But the movement in it, because it's so simple and because it's so, I don't want to say archaic, but it's not like anything you would find in a game today, most games today, or even most games back then. But because it's so weird and different, and sometimes not really enjoyable in that way, it doesn't offer you that enjoyment of actually walking around for yourself, you know? But because it restricts you in certain ways, the camera angles can be really weird and interesting. And that benefits that game quite a lot. It looks stylistically interesting to look at almost all the time because it can present you with all these obtuse camera angles, like you would see in an art house film or whatever. So it's very suitable for that kind of game. Um, so yeah, I think it's not a good term that people should resort to. Or if you are going to resort to it, you need to back it up with other things. But I think that really when somebody says a game has aged, they actually mean something a little bit different. So that's why I think that it probably shouldn't be used at all. All right. Could you explain how or why the new God of War game would benefit without having Kratos? The explanation you gave during the E3 stream didn't convince me. I'm going to read you the note that I have here because I think that I have a little note on each question to try and help me get my bearings, right? The note that I have for this one kind of says everything that I have to say. So I'm just going to read the note out, okay? My note says, I don't have some logical sound argument for it. I just don't care about Kratos anymore. Burden of proof lies more with the developers, I think. So, the point, the reason I bring this up is because I'm sorry I couldn't convince you, but I wanted to bring it up because I don't think I actually can. If the E3 stream didn't convince you, I'm not sure what I can say that would convince you, and I'm not saying that that's a problem on your behalf. I'm not sure. I would say that what I said during the E3 stream probably wasn't very persuasive, and I've thought about this question a little bit, and I've tried to come up with a more persuasive answer for it, but I just don't really have anything. I don't have a logical. There's not. It's not a thing where you can prove that the next game would be better without Kratos. I can't do that. I can say personally that I don't care about Kratos' story anymore. I just don't. And I think that, maybe this is just the difference between me and a lot of people. I talked before about how, on the last podcast, I talked about how I want games to end, to pace themselves, relatively quickly, to get in, get out, do the thing they're going to do, and end. And not that I want games to be short necessarily, just that I want games to have, relatively meaningful content at every step of the way, But the same is true for something like a story or whatever. I think this is, not to let my inner weeaboo come out again too hard after the whole East versus West debacle last time, but this is one thing that really draws me to anime, because, or I'll give you another example as well, British comedies, British TV in general, right? Yeah, I'll use this as an example instead. So, like, British TV tends to get in, do its thing, get out, and end on a good note. It ends when it's good, and I value that a lot because I think that actually lends it, in our terminology, replay value. To a degree that other things don't have. Like, I would be more than happy, and maybe this example is on my mind because I recently watched Extras again. It was on Netflix. I have Netflix on the TV. I just wanted something on for background noise. I was looking for something, so I stuck on Extras, right? It's the Ricky Gervais comedy for anybody that doesn't know what I'm talking about. And it's funny. It's really funny. It does 6 episodes per season, and because of that, it's just dense, it's good. Like, every episode feels like it's funny, like it has a funny thing it wants to do. And it's got these nice little drama moments in it and stuff like that as well. But the same is true for a lot of British comedies and stuff like that. Even going back years and years, something like Faulty Towers, there's what, 10 episodes? I don't know, there's like I'd say there's probably less than 20 episodes of Faulty Towers. I could be wrong about that, but people still watch it to this day. You ask any Irish person, my age in particular, how many times they've seen every episode of Father Ted. It's a lot. It's a lot, but it's because it's packed. It's like it got in, it did its thing, and it got out while it was still good. And I think that's very valuable. I think by dragging the thing out, by dragging God of War out, you're not getting out while it's still good. And now I don't care anymore. And now actually it retroactively impacts my enjoyment of the earlier games because in the early game, I mean, I don't want to spoil anything too hard here, but the ending of God of War 1, without spoiling anything, it was a pretty definitive ending, right? It's hard to imagine a more definitive ending for that character, actually. And I would say that even God of War 1 suffered a little by having God of War 2 and 3, And then after God of War 3, you're pushing the boat out even further. You're saying, now Kratos is in Norse land and he's going to do Norse things with Norse people for some reason. It's like, I stopped caring. I stopped caring. I thought that this character was done, And I think that, as well, just having a new character would have more freedom. With Kratos, there comes a certain amount of baggage. He has to act a certain way. He has to, he's got to build upon his character in a certain way. He's got to do certain things to live up to the expectations that fans have of him. Whereas if we had some new Norse God of War, I'm going to admit my ignorance here and say I don't know who the Norse God of War is exactly. I don't think it's Odin, because Odin is like the overall. He's like the big ancient guy, right? I don't know. Anyway, I'm letting my ignorance show here. So I don't know who the Norse God of War actually is, right? And I suppose, Kratos isn't the Greek God of War anyway. So, right, the Norse God of War, the main character would be somebody else, And that person could have a whole different, characterization to them, which contrasted them well with Kratos. Maybe some similarities and some differences. Like the action genre is full of people being sort of cheeky, laissez-faire sort of characters, like Jean from God Hand or something like that, people who don't really give a fuck. And, Kratos kind of falls into that category as well. And maybe, especially with the new tone they were going with, it would have been good to have somebody a bit more serious or somebody with a bit more, I don't know, a bit more of a stake in what was happening, or I don't know. I really don't know. I'm just saying that the possibilities were more open before they settled on Kratos. And now the possibilities have been closed in a bit more. And I know more now what to expect about the game because Kratos is in it, But I think, and the last line of my note there was, burden of proof lies more with the developers. I think the burden of proof is on them to show that the game is better with Kratos. It's not really on me to show that the game is worse with Kratos, because it really does feel like that story was over, So I think that the developers need to prove to me, a very high and mighty thing to say, I know, but the developers need to prove to me that the game is better with Kratos, because I just won't, I'll always have a picture in my mind of what the game could have been without Kratos, And I think I would be more willing to give the game a shot, if it didn't have Kratos in it, Like, as well, shoehorning this sort of more dour, it seems to be, sort of more dour story on Kratos also makes me think, this isn't really in keeping with the tone of the first three games, and so why not just have a new character, I personally, I don't get the obsession with carrying on stories and characters for years and years and years and years and years. And like I said, it's something I enjoy about, British comedies. I'll go back to the anime point. I think a lot of animes run for 26 episodes and end. And they end while they're good, Or I talked a little bit on the Ask page about the Leftovers. The Leftovers had 3 short seasons. It ended while it was good. And because of that, I now have this picture in my mind of The Leftovers as one of the greatest TV shows I've ever seen. And it will probably sit there for the rest of my life. If it had 3 more seasons, it has 3 more seasons to get worse. If it has 10 more seasons, it's going to get worse. And then I won't think quite as highly of it. I suppose the best example of that probably is The Simpsons. If The Simpsons had ended around season 10 or so, maybe season 9 or 11 or whatever, around that period, if it had ended then, it would be a classic on an enormous level. It would be this perfectly, encapsulation of the time frame that it was made in. It would be a way, The Simpsons would actually be a way that future generations could understand the time period it was made in. I actually think that strongly about that show. It was just this perfect, like, yeah, it was perfect for what it was. But now it's got 20 more seasons of mediocre shit stapled onto the end of it. And if somebody 100 years from now wants to watch The Simpsons, they've got to understand that a lot of us didn't really care for that stuff and didn't really want it anymore. But the first 10 seasons are really, really good. You have to explain to somebody. It's like if you had Shakespeare play where the first play was really good, and then he goes and does Romeo and Juliet too. Like, something about it just cheapens the first one. So yeah, but I don't have this big logical bulletproof argument I can give you that will make you change your mind. It's just not one of those things. Maybe I've swayed you a little bit more, but I feel like I've just ranted. But I think that some people will identify heavily with the rant that I've just made, so maybe it's okay. Okay. Any thoughts on the plot summary of Half-Life 2 Episode 3 by Mark Laidlaw and the implications surrounding it? So this is a little bit more of an industry-related question, but I did kind of want to bring it up now because it's just recently happened and it's on my mind. And yeah, I think it is utterly shocking. I was blown away when I actually saw that this thing had been posted and it was real, and Mark had actually done it. I still don't know how to process that this thing actually happened. So I mean, I should preface this by saying I'm not the hugest Half-Life fan out there, and I don't want anybody to jump on me for that. I think they're very good games. I think they are very, very good games. And Half-Life 1 in particular, I think I would love to go back and play it again, actually. It's been on my mind, obviously, since this whole thing happened. I would love to play that one again. I think that 2 is great. I'd say I like some things about 2 that other people don't anyway, so like I probably even like it more than a lot of people, but I do think that it's weak in some important areas as well. But yeah, it's Half-Life is obviously a very important, great series, and I just I suppose what I mean when I say I'm not the biggest Half-Life fan is that I wasn't really anticipating a Half-Life 2 Episode 3 or Half-Life 3. I wasn't like on the edge of my seat thinking, when is this game going to come out? Kind of stopped thinking about it. But then this happens and you're just like, how do you process this? I mean, the first question on my mind, even outside of the actual story that was posted, was what happened behind the scenes? Will we ever know what happened behind the scenes of this post going up online? Because I would love to know. You have to wonder, did Mark actually clear this with anybody in Valve? And I do think that's possible. Some people will scoff at the idea. I think it's possible that he talked to somebody in there and they kind of not signed off on it, but sort of gave him the nod. Maybe even Gabe himself. I don't know. I do think that Valve are a bit more open and stuff than people give them credit for, even now. Like they always have been a little bit more willing to show their work in advance, or like talk about things that not necessarily other developers don't want to talk about, but just that they never bother to. They just talk about their process and stuff like that. So I think it's possible that it was cleared with somebody involved, but in all likelihood it probably wasn't, which is kind of crazy, that Mark would actually do that. And I want to applaud him personally. Maybe it's the wrong attitude to take, but I'm impressed by the sheer balls that he had to go and do that. I don't know. It's just shocking. It just really is shocking. So as for the yeah, I would love to. If I could pick one thing in the last 5 years that's happened in games to know the whole full story of how everybody reacted to it, it would be that. I would just love to be a fly on the wall in Valve the moment that story gets posted. What the fuck happened in there that day? If they weren't aware that this was going to happen, what happened in there? It's just incredible to think the sheer panic or like the commotion that must happen. I mean, I'm sure people were actually quiet. People were like, "Oh, did you see that thing?" Kind of glancing at each other, kind of like, "Oh, I want to pretend I didn't see this and get on with my day." But like, what happened? Was there a meeting held? Did they get a few people together and hold a meeting about what they're? Surely they must have. If they weren't ready for this, surely somebody involved. Maybe it's happening today because it's Monday now. Surely somebody got together and had a meeting. Like, do we have to respond to this publicly? Do we have to make a post about it? What do we have to do? Do we have to tell people we're actually still working on Half Life, or what? And by the way, I think that's something that people have really jumped to a conclusion on, that Half Life isn't being worked on anymore. I don't think that's true necessarily. I'm not like I said, I wasn't looking forward to it. I'm not in denial about this. I wasn't anticipating the day that Half Life. I had basically given up on it already years ago. Um, I mean, as you can hear in my Portal 2 video, I'm talking a little bit about how Valve seem to be going down a bad path, and I think that has basically come to fruition at this point. Many people would agree now at this point. Um, so I've been thinking about that for a long time, and I'm not expecting Half Life even now. But I think people have really jumped to this conclusion that it's definitely not happening. And I don't think that's true, especially because on a long enough timeline, somebody is going to realize that making Half Life 3 will make a lot of money. Somebody is going to want to do it enough that it'll happen, I think. Um, but yeah. So as for the actual the synopsis itself, I think I was struck when I was reading the thing just how vividly in my mind I actually imagined the game. I don't think I'm alone in this. I don't know if it was Mark's skill as a writer, or just the it being a really suitable story for the game or something like that. But something about it really vividly brought it to life as a game in my mind, and I think that was the worst part. Is that so many people had speculated that whatever they did next, it would never live up to people's expectations. And then you read the synopsis and you realize it totally would have, especially as an episode 3, not as a Half-Life 3 maybe, but as an episode 3, something to follow episode 2. It probably, just based on the sounds of the story, if the gameplay had lived up to it, if it had been this big climactic moment with jumping through time and all this weird stuff that was happening, if it had actually delivered on that concept, it probably would have pleased people quite a lot. It probably would have been the thing that they were looking for, It's certainly more than I imagined would happen at the time. Like, you knew that the Borealis was the next thing that was going to be the objective. But I imagined a much more standard Half-Life thing going on in there. Just kind of going through the halls of kind of like the tanker in MGS2 or something. I'm suppose there's a lot of Call of Duty missions that are like that. Just kind of going through an area like that. That's kind of what I imagine, and going through the Combine forces there, and maybe getting to some cool thing inside, like some cool contraption inside it. I didn't really imagine this whole, crazy thing. I'm trying not to be too specific in case somebody hasn't read it, but I didn't imagine all the stuff that was in that synopsis, and I think it would have been really cool. So I'm mostly just shocked that happened, and I still can't believe it. I think it's crazy. Yeah, I suppose I don't have any more to say, but I wanted to bring it up because I feel like people are kind of getting over it already, and I'm not sure that I am. Like I said, I'm over the fact that the game will never come out, but just the fact that this event happened, where Half-Life 3 Episode 3 was released as a piece of text, it's just insane. It's insane, but I'm not going to dwell on it because clearly I've run out of things to say. Anyway. So here we have another slightly, well, more personal question. I'm going to get into a bit more personal stuff for this one, I think. So, question: do you feel obligated to play certain games at night? I'm playing Prime 2, Metroid Prime 2, I presume that is, right now, and while it's not a horror game, I feel obligated to only play it at night due to the more tense atmosphere. I generally give every game where I don't know its atmosphere the same treatment of at least starting it at night. For example, I gave 999, that's 9 hours, 9 persons, 9 doors. Is it doors or rooms? Doors. Why can't I just read the fucking question? For example, I gave 999 this treatment, not knowing it had a horror-like atmosphere, and I felt like it greatly enhanced my experience than if I played it during nighttime. I'm sorry to be pedantic about the game names. I just want to be clear for people who haven't got the question on screen, or don't know what games are being referred to. I just want, just for the sake of clarity, that's all. Yeah. So anyway, I'm brought this one up because it's a cool question. I don't. It's the kind of thing I care deeply about that I think a lot of people don't. So that's why I chose to answer it, even though I don't have much more to add than what you've said. Basically, I agree with what you're saying. Um, First of all, I should say, as a public figure, as you know, an influencer, I'm an opinion influencer. You know, uh, it's bad for your eyes. That's what everybody seems to say. You know, you're supposed to take a break. It's bad for your eyes. Don't do it. Now, as Matthew Matosis, as a person, as like just a guy, totally do it. It's the best way to play games. It really is. So I suppose the nice middle ground would probably be to have a soft light in the room, you know, and maybe do take a break every once in a while. But for me, that's not what I do. I really do like to get into a nice dark quiet room and just sit down and play something like that. I agree that some games benefit from it more than others. As a tangent, I want to bring up so you can get some insight into my life here. You might have even heard some cars going out the window. Here, I have the window closed. If I had the window open, you wouldn't be able to hear me sometimes when I'm talking. That's how loud that shit gets outside. But I have a big window next to me, and it's a very strange window. Okay, because it it's it's so close to the wall that there's not really any room to put up a curtain, like a curtain pole for it. And it just has these little blinds on it. I think if I knew I was going to be living here for as long as I have, which is like 5 or 6 years, I probably would have found some way to get some kind of pole up on top, even just by cutting the end of it off and just being careful not to drop the curtain off the end. But it's a bit late for that now. But anyway, uh, so there's no room for a curtain, and there's just these little twisty blinds. You know, the ones where you twist them, like you'd see in an office. You twist them, and they block out some light. Maybe some of you have those on your windows as well. Um, and it's daytime now. It's morning now, and the sun is shining in, and the room is bright, even though I have the things closed. And it drives me up the fucking wall. I have to say, it really does. And this is why when I first started doing when I left my day job a year ago, over a year ago now, actually, I started when I started doing this, I was like, okay, I'm gonna try and make a regime for myself and be up during the day and do the 9 to 5 regular hours because it'll keep me more productive. And I did that for a long time, and I really only recently have really come to terms with the fact that it actually hurt my productivity because I was sitting here during the day, and during the day I'm so much less enthused to actually sit down and play something for a big stretch of time because the room isn't dark enough for me to really get into it a lot of the time. So I found a lot of the time I was actually just staying up late, doing like work that I didn't really need to be doing during the day, like looking at a script again, that I could have done later and probably might have been better done later after I'd played the game more and stuff like that, or done my recording exercise and all that. And then I was waiting until nighttime to actually fucking play the games. So now I don't bother to do that. And that's why I'm up at 9 a.m. It's not that I wake up early, it's that I've been up for hours at this point. But yeah, that drives me up the wall. It really does. I'm getting angry just talking about it. Um, so it's something that and the noise as well. I can't have the fucking window open or it's too noisy. Um, and these are things that I care deeply about, and it frustrates me a lot. And so I would encourage anybody, especially if you have, because in my old bedroom back home, I was in the attic, and the only bad thing about being in the attic really was when it rained, it made this, it made a lot of noise. And I don't really mind that. I like the sound of rain. So it's not really a big deal for me. Even when I'm playing something, I feel like I can tune that out pretty well. Whereas here, it's like Chinese water torture. You've got a car going past at random intervals, and you never know when it's going to happen. So, what rain is this nice constant thing. The only thing is, it's a problem when I'm actually trying to record audio back there. But, it's this nice constant noise. And so that's the only problem there. I had these things called blackout blinds where you could, I don't know if anybody knows what I mean by that. Basically, you pull this blind down and the room just goes pitch black. They let no light in whatsoever. So I would do that all the time and just, be able to sit around in my room and play games all the time. So I think that a comfortable environment is really important for games, and I don't want to give somebody a rule to follow, like you must play in a dark room, especially because it is bad for your eyes, right? You must play in a dark room, and you have to have all the lights off, and you gotta have no noise whatsoever, blah blah blah. But I do think if you have the ability to play games comfortably, take advantage of it as much as you can. Another thing I would say is try to avoid interruptions. And this is a big one in this day and age, and this is a much bigger problem than what you've brought up in the question. Like for example, a lot of games do benefit by being played at night. If you play, I think it's Amnesia, they actually say, this game is best experienced, and I love this about this game. I think more games should do this, even non-horror games should do this. They tell you how to best enjoy the game. Play it with headphones on, play it in a dark room if you can. Really get into it like that. And because some people just don't bother to think about those things, so I do think that this is something that should be brought up more often. The actual environment that you play the game in. But I don't want to lay down rules for anybody. If you're comfortable playing in a bright, open room with lots of noise coming in, so be it. But I think that interruptions are perhaps a bigger problem, and a bigger problem in this day and age when everybody's attached to their phones all the time. And it's one reason why I don't really want to get too much into social media or anything like that. Like, for example, you might notice I'm not on Twitter all that much, or I tend to go on Twitter in batches. I'm on it and I answer a bunch of people and then I'm gone, right? If you've looked at my Twitter habits, you'll see that about me. The reason for that is I don't have Twitter installed on my phone because I don't want to be interrupted all the time with it buzzing. I actually did have it installed for a while, and even worse, I had I had this thing, I don't have it anymore, but I had this thing where when I started the channel, I would get an email whenever anybody subscribed, because it was this really slow trickle of subscribers, and it was kind of interesting to me to know when it was going up. So I'm at like 20 subscribers, and I'd get like a ding, and it would be this nice thing to hear in the middle of the day. You'd hear this ding, and you go, "Oh, that's somebody subscribed to me. That's nice." And then over time, it just becomes this ding, 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 ding. Just worse and worse every day. So that's gone. I don't have Twitter on my phone. I don't really use my phone all that much, and part of the reason for that, I've talked before about the fact that I'm not very sociable. That's true. But I think a bigger problem for me is that I just because it would be kind of nice if I'm out somewhere. It'd be kind of nice if I was on the bus or out somewhere or bored somewhere. It'd be kind of nice to be able to just go on Twitter and reply to people about things and kind of get that done while I can't do anything else. But the reason I don't do that is because I don't want to be interrupted. I don't want to have things going off, and I know I can just kind of turn it off. But I think the temptation would be stronger if I had the app there all the time, and I think that a lot of people do suffer from that in this day and age, where they're constantly checking things, or I don't know. I think it's a shame. I think the best way to experience a game, and I'll agree with you on this, not just atmospheric games, although they benefit the most. I think that most games are best played in a dark room with as little noise as possible, with as few interruptions as possible, and just really get into it. And I know that's not always possible to do, but it's definitely my preferred way of playing stuff. I think it's not just that you end up playing more of the game and getting more enjoyment out of it that way. I just think qualitatively, moment to moment, you enjoy the game more moment to moment if you do that. So if you're the type of person who is interrupted all the time, or you don't, maybe try the things that I've described and maybe see if they help improve your play experience with games. That's the main reason why I wanted to bring this up, because I don't really have a particularly good answer for it. But it's just something I wanted to raise with people so that, think about it. Think about it. But just be aware it's probably not good for you. Yeah. Next question. Worst game problem that seems like it'd be really easy to fix, and also smallest game problem that seems like it'd be hard to fix. I almost didn't answer this one because it's kind of broad, but so I suppose what I want to say is don't take my answer on this as an absolute. As I said many times in the last podcast, all these things vary from game to game. But I do see what you're getting at here, and I do think I have two answers which make a lot of sense for this. So, the worst problem that seems like it'd be really easy to fix is not being able to skip cutscenes. And I find it's shocking that this is a thing you still... I think there's very few games nowadays that have long cutscenes that you can't skip. I think that that's something that developers have gotten over, right? But I do think there's a lot of, medium-sized cutscenes that developers don't really mind you having to sit through all the time, which I think is just crazy in this day and age. Even if it's just a 15-second thing when you enter a level, 15 seconds when you enter a level. It doesn't sound too bad, but it's a big problem, I think. And it's, of course, it should be easy to put that skip option in there. Now, obviously, there can be exceptions if the game is using the loading screen or the cutscene to mask a loading time. Then it's kind of understandable. But even then, maybe you could say that that's bad practice in the first place, right? Maybe we're reaching the point now where that is just a bad idea to do it that way because people want to skip cutscenes so badly that you shouldn't rely on being able to load in the middle of a cutscene. A lot easier for me to say that than done, obviously, but I think it's maybe a fair point worth bringing up, even if it's a very difficult problem to solve in that sense. But I think there's probably a lot of cutscenes out there in games, even today, that aren't loading anything and you still can't skip them. And occasionally you still get a game with longer cutscenes that you can't skip, and I think it's crazy that that still happens. If I'm not allowed to go with that, then I would say, like the Fury, when I did my review on that, those forced walking sections are essentially cutscenes in a lot of senses, and so maybe they should be skippable too. I think particularly, it's less like something like The Last of Us. I can kind of understand why they don't want you to skip them. I still think that maybe the option should be there in case somebody just really likes the gameplay of that game. I do think that the gameplay in that game is better than a lot of people give it credit for, but somebody might just want to go in and just hammer through all the, stealth, shooting, whatever segments. They should probably be able to do that, but it's more understandable in that game because that's kind of experience you're going in for. With something like Fury, I think I brought up a good point in that video where I said, even though the walking sections are a large part of it, they're just so boring and simple that there really is no reason not to skip them, and they kind of block you from experiencing parts of the story and not others. You might really find just one or two of the sections boring and like other ones. Like, for example, the one where you're in the architect's room and you kind of go up this big staircase. Maybe you find that really boring just because it's this indoor locale that looks the same the whole time, so you want to skip that one, but you want to watch all the other ones. Players should be able to do that. So I think that's the biggest problem, the one that seems easiest to fix when it comes to big problems, and the one that developers, I think the criteria for choosing that answer as well is that developers should know to do it at this point. It should be the done thing. Yeah, but again, I would bring up like counterexample, something like Eco or The Last Guardian. If you want to skip the walking segments in that, take the game out of the console and put it away, because that's what the game is. So like when it comes to some games, there's no point in giving you that option because that is the game. So, or like Journey, for example, you want to skip the walking segments in Journey, turn it off because that's all you're getting. So again, just to stress my whole point about games all being different, there you go. I'll try not to bring that up every single podcast, but I do think I might because it's a very important thing to me. Anyway, smallest game problems that seems like it'd be hard to fix. This is one I hear people complain about a lot, and I think that people don't really understand how hard this problem is to fix. Clipping. Clipping is not an easy problem to solve. It takes, for the amount of detriment it causes to a game, the amount of effort it takes to avoid every instance of it is just too much. I think that there's a good chance we will never get a game ever that doesn't have some kind of clipping in it, at least not any kind of significant, large budget, you play as a human style game. And there's a couple of reasons for this. First of all, if you have, like, there's several different types of clipping even, like you have characters that animate and they might have, part of their body might clip into itself because of the way the animator has done it. And that should be easier to avoid. But even then, it's only really bad if you can actually see the other side of the clipping where the other part comes out. Like it's kind of natural for people to deform a little bit while they move around, right? We're squishy beings. So I suppose what you mean when you say clipping is, you can see the other side clip through, right? So when you're animating, you want to try and avoid that, but the amount of effort that it actually takes to do that is big. It's not trivial. It's not trivial at all. The reason for that is because if you want to avoid 100% of clipping, like the systematic solution to avoid clipping on everything in the game would be to have every single polygon do collision detection, right? And that's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen, Um, that's the reason why clipping is still a thing. Uh, and like it gets like really bad and complicated when you have like cloth dynamics happening. Again, that's the kind of thing where if this thing is never to clip with anything else, then it has to collide with everything else. So that's the problem. That's why it happens. So, and I totally get it. And I do think there are instances where you can and should complain about it. Like if it's really obvious clipping on something, a big part of the game, the Wind Waker boat, where it clips through the bottom of the boat and it looks like the boat is constantly flooding with water. That's bad. It's bad. It should have been avoided, and it would have been easier to avoid than a lot of other clipping scenarios, I think. So there's that. It's not that it's never worth complaining about, but it's just in a lot of instances, people complain about it where it's just not viable for it to do it any other way, or the amount of effort it would take to do it the other way is just so not worth it. So keep that in mind if you're ever annoyed by clipping. It's a problem I would love to see solved, but it's just computationally and in terms of manpower, it's just not. It's too much. It's too much. Too small a problem for too much effort. Okay, next question. Gotta scroll up here. Right, here we go. What is the worth of an objective point of view when looking at games? Example, there is a wide variety of players who didn't enjoy The Last Guardian, but those who did enjoy it hold the game in very high regard. Is something like this at the fault of the game? I think this is almost kind of a little bit similar to the Platinum question at the start, except that was about combat systems, and this is about something else entirely. But I think that one thing that I would like to just clear up right off the bat is that I'm not going to say there's no such thing as objectivity. I was almost about to say that, right? But I would say that an objective point of view is not really worth anything. So, like, for example, if I was to give you an objective point of view of The Last Guardian, right? What would I say? I would say The Last Guardian is a game where you control a boy. The boy can jump. The boy can hang on to Trico. Trico is a giant beast. The boy can issue commands to Trico. Trico can navigate the environment. The environment. Well, what can I actually say about the environment that's objective? I'm not even sure of anything I could say about the environment that is an objective piece of information. Like, for example, I could say the environment is cramped, right? I think many people would agree to that, or at least I certainly felt that way when I played it. But that's not objective information because, the whole reason I think that the game was surprisingly cramped was because before I played it, I expected there to be more wide open spaces, and I expected there to be more wide open spaces because I expected that making Trico was already such a challenge that there was no way the developers were going to have a load of cramped spaces in the game, because that would make the already difficult challenge of getting Trico to look natural much, much, much harder, right? But then they went and did it. They just went off the deep end and just did like one of the most challenging things they could have done. And so I think that the environments were surprisingly cramped, but that's not objective information about the game at all, because that implies a certain sort of mindset going into the game, or certain expectations. And if you don't really understand what it is that makes Trico impressive on a technical level, then you don't really care that the environments are cramped, because there's nothing especially, if you're not thinking about it that way, there's nothing especially interesting about the fact that he can move through all these cramped spaces and still look natural. There's nothing interesting to you about that if you don't appreciate that aspect of the game, which I very much did. So, like, I think that's probably one of the most technically impressive things I've seen in the last 5 years in games, right? But a lot of people won't see that because they don't understand the challenges that went into actually making that happen. So, even that one line, the environments are cramped, right? The environments are, we could use like even less sort of loaded terms, right? The environments are small or something like that. It's not objective information because it implies a certain sort of understanding of how the game was going to be, or how other games are, is it cramped compared to other games? What's all that mean? So I think that you could put together objective information about a game, but that's just a fact sheet, right? It doesn't really tell you anything interesting. Even if you delve in, even if you were to delve in really, really deep into the mechanics, right? If you were to keep it objective, you would say basically nothing interesting. I think anyway. So for example, I let's say I don't know, we were emulating the Last Guardian, or I frame by frame did an analysis of it, right? So I found out when you jump, your hitbox is this big, and it can't actively grab anything for X number of frames, and it moves in this sort of arc, and it's got this property to it. What does that tell you? It doesn't tell you anything. And to actually tell me anything interesting about the jump, you need to give me subjective information. You need to say, oh, the jump felt good, or the jump felt bad, or it feels good compared to this game but not compared to that game, or it doesn't have this sort of feel, or it looks good but it doesn't feel good, or something. Like that's subjective information. It is subjective information, and I think that this is something I would like to clear up. It's a misunderstanding I see sometimes propagated about my videos. For example, I'll sometimes see a comment online like, Matthew Matosis, not to toot my own horn, but this is genuinely stuff that I see. Matthew Matosis is, the best reviewer because he is, the most objective, right? And I don't think that I'm objective, which isn't to say that my videos don't contain objective statements. They do. They have facts in them, right? But I think, and I hope what people really mean by when they say that, whether they realize it or not, is that I've presented you the argument in such a way that I've backed it up so much that it almost seems like a fact, right? That it's so well supported, it seems like a fact, but it's actually not factual. You know what I mean? It's like if I tell you that something is really good, and I would believe that certain things in games are really, really good. I'm trying to think of the best example in my mind. I don't know. Like, let's say we're talking about a Mario game, and I'm talking about how. Right, for example, Mario, right? Mario, here's a good example, actually. In Mario, I talked about how in Mario 64 and Mario Sunshine, the movement was more interesting, and it was more open, and you could do more things with it. And I think I made a pretty strong case as to why Mario should go back to a style like that rather than the more restrictive style, right? But that doesn't mean that there's a bunch of people out there who actually preferred the way that Mario handled in Galaxy or in 3D World, right? I think Galaxy is probably the better exception here because the way I talked about the spin move killing your momentum, okay? For me, that's a terrible thing. I don't like that at all because it really slows me down and so on and so forth. But that spin is what Nintendo calls a jump assist, right? You might notice that they like these jump assists, right? It's a thing that gives you the ability to correct your jump in the air. So Mario 64, notoriously punishing for when you jump, very little you can do to alter it, right? Whereas, even compared to the 2D Marios, they were a lot more forgiving. So all of their 3D games have jump assist in them in various forms. Now, in Sunshine has the most obvious one, which is the backpack. And 3D World has it in the form of power-ups, where you get a power-up and they generally are all some form of jump assist. Actually, no, they're not. No, not in 3D World. But, the most famous one, the Tanuki thing, is a jump assist, right? It allows you to stay in the air longer, or you've got the helicopter box thing, stuff like that, things that make jumping easier for you, right? And that's why they're very valuable to some people, and even people like me. I'm not trying to talk about my skill as though I'm beyond the pale or something. It's it's valuable to me as well. If I miss time a jump, I want to have the jump assist there to help me out, right? But it's not in something like Galaxy. The jump assist is very good because it kills your momentum. It enables you, if you overshoot something, you kill your momentum in time, you can drift back to it, But for me, that's not as valuable. I don't value that anywhere near as much as the fluid movement of Mario 64 and Sunshine. So I would like to think, and I would like Nintendo to move in that direction. Hopefully with Odyssey, it looks like they're bringing some of that stuff back. So I think I'm going to get my wish there, at least to some degree. But for some players it is the other way around, where they preferred it the other way, you know. And I would hope that, you know, we could get those players to appreciate the Mario 64 and Sunshine system, and that's really the battle for me, is to try to get people to shift their thinking from one style to another, you know. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that other style is bad. Like if Nintendo, you know, goes with one system over the other, necessarily some people are going to be left out, you know. It's just I don't like being the one to be left out, you know. So that's why I make the case for my side. So it's not an objective point of view, but it makes sense to me, and it's how I feel about the game, and I think I supported it well. Now some of my things, and again, this is where I said earlier, I don't think it's quite as binary as objective subjective. I do think there are arguments. Maybe it's more about how well supported your argument is, you know, with objective facts about things. But I do think there are some things that I feel more strongly about and are more confident in saying that should be the case, and other things where I don't. So I would have to admit, in the Mario case, there are some people who will always prefer a different sort of movement system. I'm trying to think about how best to get this across. Yeah, so people say, you know, that my videos are objective, and they aren't, and I don't think that I don't think that there's no point making objective statements. I just think that if you're trying to build your whole thing around objectivity, then you're probably not saying anything interesting. I think if you want a good example of how to use this well, to toot my own horn again, the sort of pattern you will find in the Devil May Cry video that I made is that there is moments of objective kind of fact statement making in there to introduce a topic and to bring it in and to ease you into the more subjective part of the topic. And I think that that's where objectivity comes in terms of game reviews, is that you do something quickly to establish a fact. Emphasis on quickly, my god, you don't need to belabor points that are obvious to anybody who's played the game, right? This is the whole thing we want to avoid, because objectivity is not saying anything valuable, okay? At least that's how I feel about it anyway, right? Generally. So you want to do that, and then you get into the more interesting stuff, which tends to be the more subjective stuff. And so I really don't know what to think when people say that my videos are objective, and it still comes up all the time. And I believe, you know, I don't think I have, and I don't imagine that I ever would, even 5 or 6 years ago. I don't think I've ever said that my videos are objective. They're not. You know, there's always something subjective in there, you know, or else it wouldn't really be doing anything interesting. So for, you know, something like The Last Guardian, you know, you're asking, is something like this the fault of the game that a lot of people didn't enjoy it? So the next question kind of follows on from this, okay? So I'm going to read the next question now. This was by a different person, but I think that they're related, okay? The quality of immersion seems to be fairly inconsistent across many games and player preferences. It's only logical to assume that immersion is partly cultivated by the developer and met halfway by the player. Do you agree with this? If so, what prerequisites, if any, are needed for immersion to take place? First of all, reading this, I am struck by how immaculately constructed that question is. So congratulations on that. It is a really well worded question. So thank you for that. Yeah, so the quality of immersion. I think that this is a multi-level issue, okay? And the first thing, I'll start off with the most controversial point, okay? The first thing is that, and it depends on the game, but the first thing is that I think players need to acquire a certain level of skill before they can actually appreciate immersion on any sort of reasonable level. So if, for example, you're playing a game, and it could be The Last Guardian or it could be something else, right? If you're playing a game and you're struggling with the controls, you know, you're not going to be into it on the level as somebody for whom the controller has disappeared, okay? And I think that that's generally, I think games should be trying to do this anyway. They should be trying to remove the controller from the player's mind, right? But particularly if you want the player to be sort of immersed in your experience and really get into it mentally, the controller has to disappear, right? And you can pretend that you don't know what I mean by that and say that I'm not explaining this point well, but you really do know what I mean by that. I think everybody listening to this knows what I mean. You have those games where the controller disappears, and for me, having played so many games, that is practically every game at this point. There's very few games where I'm thinking about the controller constantly. Um, but that the majority of games, the controller disappears for me. But for a lot of people, they're not as experienced, and this is the kind of thing that it really gets people's back up. Like, you're not allowed to say this. You're not allowed to say that maybe the reason somebody didn't enjoy The Last Guardian is because they weren't particularly good at it. But I do think that that's true. I do think that that can be absolutely 100% true. I think it can be true of pretty much everything, and I think it's why. And again, I'm kind of using up points that I would probably bring up in a video here, but for example, okay, the Last Guardian or the Journey is the perfect example. Okay, the reason Journey is simple, the reason it's such a simple game to play, is because they wanted to maximize the number of people who would play it, for whom the controller would disappear from their mind, and they would be able to just be in the game world. Not feeling the controller, not thinking about what button do I need to press here, just actually being the character in the screen. That's why it's a simple game. It's because some people can't process more stuff than that. And so you get Journey, and then The Last Guardian is more complicated than that. And I'm not going to say that The Last Guardian has a perfect control scheme or anything like that. I think I posted before some problems that I had with it. Particularly, if I can make one change to the game, I would make it so that if you hold the drop button, I forget what it is, but when you're on Trico, you can press a button to... Is it you press a button? You press a button to let go of him, right? But then it will automatically catch you on him again, I think. What I would do is I would take that and make it so that if you hold that button, you fall until you let go of the button. Like, the boy won't automatically grab something again until you let go of circle or whatever it is. That would make getting off Trico a hell of a lot easier, which I think would be a nice thing. But so I'm not going to say that the controls aren't to blame exactly, but I do think that in the case of The Last Guardian, that could be a large part of it, is that people just, and especially because it's the type of game where, if you weren't a big Team Eco fan, you're going to be even more left out than before, because the control schemes of Eco and The Last Guardian were a little bit more current. I don't know if that's the right term, but like, they're a little bit strange. They've gotten stranger and stranger over time relative to current games. You know what I mean? Current games don't value the sort of movement style, the cinematic sort of style of movement and stuff that they have. And so if you didn't enjoy the other games, you didn't play them, you haven't gotten used to that, then The Last Guardian is going to be even worse, because you're not used to it, and you might be judging it against a standard that's not really fair or relevant for that game, right? I think this is starting to bleed into the next point that I wanted to make, so I'm gonna start talking about that now. Basically, the thing, if you want to get immersed in the game, the next thing you need to do, apart from removing the controller from your brain, is you need to approach it with the right expectations, right? You need to have some idea of what the game is going to be and make an effort to sort of play the game or engage with the game in a way that the developers intended you to, right? So, and this is where The Last Guardian becomes especially relevant. So when The Last Guardian came out, there was, some people talking about how it wasn't as well received as the previous Team Eco games, which seems to be true on the whole. I kind of saw this coming, because the game had been in development for so long. That's the kind of thing that just makes people want to shit on it. People love nothing more than to tear something down that's been in development for a long time. And I'd also think that, the Team Eco games had gained even more attention over the last 10 years. And some people just don't like that, and again want an excuse to kind of rip into them a little bit. But that's really just me with my tinfoil hat on. The fact that that my expectation of how the game was going to be received was confirmed doesn't actually prove anything. But I was interested to see, what it is that people are saying about the game, if they're thinking about it negatively. What are the negatives of this game in the eyes of these people? And so I went on Metacritic and I looked at some of the negative reviews on there, and I'm not sure I've ever actually read a full review of The Last Guardian, because I've talked before about how I do try to keep myself closed off a little bit from what other reviewers are saying, but in this case I was just really interested in what people had to say. So, I'm looking for what the negatives are, and people, and I went out and read a bunch of this stuff. And it's funny because I think that the biggest, most common complaint that you'll find in negative or less positive, because a lot of them aren't even totally negative reviews actually, but I don't want to mischaracterize anybody's reviews, but the most common thing that I saw anyway, people saying was something along the lines of, Trico is unresponsive and that's annoying and bad, right? And it's funny to me because I can't think of a more vapid or irrelevant thing to say about The Last Guardian than Trico is unresponsive. It is just I mean, it's should be obvious to you from the first few minutes of gameplay, or even just from watching a trailer, that it wasn't going to be this thing where you would have perfect control over a Trico at all times. That is established very early on and is very clearly not the point of the game. And I suppose I could talk about that at length, but I think maybe the easiest way to think about this is just to reverse your thinking on it, right? I wonder if people would actually be convinced by this or not, because I have the feeling, if you're somebody who says Trico is unresponsive and that's bad and blah blah blah, maybe this won't convince you. But I think it's a very convincing argument, right? So just flip your thinking on it and imagine a version of The Last Guardian where Trico did everything you wanted him to do exactly the moment you told him to do it. Like, it is the most responsive thing you've ever seen. I think it is unequivocally a worse game. It is just so much worse because it would rob him of all personality or all sense of actually being another creature separate from you. Just try to imagine it, try to picture it, especially if you're somebody who didn't enjoy The Last Guardian. Really try to picture that in your head. What is it that you wanted out of Trico when you say that he's unresponsive? You wanted him to respond to something immediately, the moment it was done. And I think I can kind of understand these complaints to some degree, but what really annoys me when I read it is, and sometimes this is more of an implication or kind of hinted at than an actual outright said, but some people will outright say this, in comments even, like, Trico is unresponsive and a game being unresponsive is bad, right? And that is just really, really, um it really gets to me. It's, one of these things that just gets to me. It's like, the point is the point is every game has to be judged on its own merits, okay? And I would be the first person to say that for the most games we probably could lay down a quote unquote rule that says responsive controls are a good thing. And I've played so many games where I would say that, when I play Mario, I want that to be responsive. When I play Devil May Cry, I want that to be responsive. When I play, loads of other games, I want that to be a responsive experience for me. But it doesn't mean that every single game should be like that. And I really resent the implication that every game needs to be like that. And I think it shows very rigid sort of thinking. And I really wish I could snap people out of that habit. I actually toyed with the idea of doing a video of, like, how to enjoy The Last Guardian, which isn't necessarily how to play it. It's not about, what controls you use. It's more about getting yourself into the mindset of enjoying it. Because I think that's the big problem with that game, is a lot of people just can't let go of these ideas that they have in their mind about how a game, quote unquote, should be done. And I alluded to it earlier, and this is basically the reason why I don't make videos about games as a general topic. Because even if what I said in a video was like, in an action game, like Devil May Cry, this is how the responsive controls are done, like when you press the button, Dante attacks immediately, and that's really good, and it gives you this really good feedback, and so on and so forth. I think the danger there, and I think this is something that really has been a problem with games, maybe the biggest problem with games, the audience of games, is that people just get into this mindset of that's the way games should be done. And I think the rule driven nature of games kind of lends itself more to that thinking. I think I even said something earlier on maybe about how games kind of, to me seem a bit more like a medium where you can sort of lay down rules, but maybe that's just all an illusion, maybe that's not true at all. I think we collectively we really need to try and avoid that temptation to lay down rules for everything. And that's why The Last Guardian, that's, I think, the biggest problem with The Last Guardian was more how people approached it than anything with the game itself. But you know, as somebody who enjoyed the game, you know, if you heard that and you're somebody who didn't enjoy the game, you probably dismiss that completely. But I genuinely believe that, and I would love to be the person who could get other people to enjoy that game the same way I did. You know, that I'd love nothing more than to do that. But I think going back to that point from a second ago, you know, there other mediums do have a lot of rules as well. Like for example, a lot of good practice. I think we need to distinguish between what is, you know, generally good game design for every game and just good practice, you know. But so for example, like good practice in film would be, you know, don't frame the shots so that the secondary character on the right has half of their face cut off, right? You know, you either want them to be in the frame or out of the frame, and if they're kind of halfway in, at the very least they need to be not in focus or something like that, you know. Or the very famous example is, you know, when you have characters talking and doing the sort of shot reverse shot thing, you've got the invisible line that you don't cross. If you don't know what I mean, you should maybe look that up. The invisible line. I'm not sure what the name of it is. But basically, the camera has this line. It can't go more than 180 degrees or else the characters will flip sides. And if they do, that's disorientating, you know? But that doesn't mean it should never be done. I don't think that anybody should take that away. And I think that when it comes to other mediums, you know, they understand that. They sort of implicitly understand that in a way that games audience don't, you know? Like, I'm sure if you analyze the films of, I don't know, David Lynch or something like that, he probably breaks a lot of the so-called rules. But it's the way he breaks those rules and what he does with it that makes those films interesting. You know, some of the best pieces of art are the ones that actually break the rules, because the artist doesn't break the rule, and you know, it's not like they're being stupid purposefully. You know, they're not ignorantly doing something they're not supposed to. They're willfully doing something that people kind of say you shouldn't do. And that's exactly the case with The Last Guardian. They willfully made Trico not respond to you perfectly, because the easiest thing to do would have been to just latch on some, you know, like in the code you could just easily make it so that when you point at something, no matter where Trico is or what he's doing, he just goes there and he does it. You know, that would be actually be the easier solution to implement in the game. And the reason they didn't do that was so that he could have life and personality of his own and be a real creature. You know, I think maybe part of the problem, again, this is more specific to The Last Guardian, is that maybe people just lack patience, you know? I think you could probably go back every generation in human history and they would say that more about the next generation after them, is they lack patience more. Because I do get the impression that we lack patience more and more as time goes by, you know, and I could go all armchair philosopher and speculate reasons why that might be. Maybe it's the internet, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, just because people have been saying it for years and years and years doesn't mean it's not necessarily true. I do think that people have less patience these days, and that's part of the problem, is that you need to let go and just enjoy the game and not constantly be going, I need to get from here to there as quick as possible, and fuck you, why aren't you moving, go, 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 go. But just relax, take it in. You know, the whole game is just relax, take it in, go. You know, there are moments where you have to rush or you will be in a panic and so forth. There's, you know, nice emotional ups and downs. So I think to recap, because I've kind of rambled quite a lot, I think the 3 points that I really covered was that first, you need to reach a level of skill where the controller disappears for you. Second, you need to judge the game for what it is and not for what it isn't, and not constantly be thinking about, oh, it should be more responsive, it should be this or that. You know, in a lot of cases that would be true for a lot of games, but in this case I don't think it's a worthwhile or relevant point to make whatsoever. And, you know, lastly, I can't even remember whatever I just said a few seconds ago. But there was a third point in there somewhere. Okay, next question. How important is pacing to you? Do you get fatigued while playing a slow/fast-paced game after a while and need to switch? After playing Persona 5, I realized I needed a game with both faster gameplay and faster pacing. I'm going to give a brief answer to this one because I've been going for 2 hours already, so maybe I'll be brief on the rest of them. I don't have much to say about this. But I think it is an important thing, but I also want to bring it up again as another one of those nothing words. You know, pacing doesn't actually mean anything by itself. And we kind of intuitively understand when you say Persona 5 is slow paced. I think everybody understands what you mean by that. So in that, slow paced would be again more descriptive than just saying pacing. Like as though there's some kind of yardstick we can use to measure all games. I don't think that's true. But when you say something like slow paced, you're getting more descriptive, and that's more useful. And I think most of us could agree that Persona 5 is a relatively slow paced game. Um, but I think it's valuable, and I think what you're saying there is good as well about wanting things to be different, paced. If you're playing Persona 5 and then maybe you go and you play something afterwards that gets your adrenaline up or whatever, and then you go back to a slower paced game as well. I actually have a semi-related question on that as well. Yeah, so I'll bring up the next question. Uh, how do you distinguish between something being mechanically built towards a particular mood and just general laziness on the developer's part? Example, I'm playing Dragon Quest IX currently, and while I wouldn't say it's hard or mentally interesting, I don't think that's the point of the game. If anything, I think it was developed almost to be kind of a comfort food of sorts. Just a comfy game you play for the mood, or at least I think that's the case. I'm not sure how to make heads or tails of it, hoping for some insight. I think this is the kind of thing where it gets very tempting to say, if you're like, how do you distinguish between a game being mechanically built towards a particular mood, right? You get so the word there, mechanically. You think, it's tempting to start going, well, how do we think about the mechanics in terms of, is it slow? Like, are the battles prolonged, or what is it? But I think that mechanically, the mechanics, when it comes to the mood, the mechanics aren't the most interesting or most important part. They're not the most important part. I think this is one of those points where you have to look at the audio visual part of the game and judge it by those standards and see, the mechanics kind of have to fall in line with those, or vice versa. And then that's how you get the impression of what the game overall is looking for. And I thought up an example which I hope illustrates this. So you've got Majora's Mask, right, and The Wind Waker. They're both Zelda games, right? They're both kind of similar structurally and in terms of gameplay. Obviously, there's some big differences between them, but we can agree that you go into dungeons in both games and you use the items to solve the dungeon and blah blah blah. But The Wind Waker is a nice, comfy, relaxing game that you put on when you want to chill out, and Majora's Mask is this game filled with dread and a timer counting down your every move and so on. And so the 3-day system in Majora's Mask is something that a lot of people hate because it gives them stress, right? It stresses them out, and that's part of the point, is that it's not supposed to feel good to have your work constantly reset and constantly have this deadline because the world is ending, right? And the whole game reinforces that through its audio visual design, like the music, wonderful, absolutely wonderful soundtrack, with the Clocktown music becoming more and more frantic every day, and just even the color scheme. There's something slightly sinister about even the rainbowy colors used in the game, and obviously the moon itself, just nightmare fuel, right? And then you look at the Wind Waker, nice cartoony. Link has these big cat eyes, and he looks at everything quizzically in the world around him, and he moves around, and the blades of grass are these big, satisfying things to cut, and the color palette is all these really bright blues and greens and stuff like that. So it's not a case that mechanically they're entirely one or the other. Mechanically, the Wind Waker, you can, if you break down the mechanics, you can feel that vibe there a bit more. You can feel the oppressiveness of having a timer ticking down everything. But most games, even sinister games, is not that obvious. It's just not that obvious what the sinister element of the mechanics actually is. If you had two shooter games, and one of them is Dead Space and the other one is, I don't know, Uncharted, right? You've got Dead Space on one hand, Uncharted on the other. Uncharted is the light, comfy might be the wrong word, but it's the light-hearted Indiana Jones, put it on, have some fun thing. Dead Space is the stick your headphones on, get into dread, just the sound effects are just, great. They really, really good horror vibe to it, relies on jump scares a bit much, but I think that point has been belabored at this point. So Dead Space has this really horrible, oppressive atmosphere, and Uncharted has the light, atmosphere, right? So with Majora's Mask and the Wind Waker, it's a lot more obvious which one mechanically is the comfortable one. The Wind Waker has these long stretches of time where you're not doing all that much. Majora's Mask has these oppressive clock where you're constantly pressured to feel like you have to do something all the time. Very, very different. But if you look at Dead Space and Uncharted, not so different mechanically. Like you walk around and you shoot things. It's not that different from one another. If you were to take Dead Space and Uncharted, take away all the visual elements and all the sound elements and just have hitboxes moving around shooting things, you wouldn't really know which one was the comfortable one and which one was the oppressive one. It wouldn't really unless like an enemy jumps out in the Dead Space one, that might be your one indication. An enemy jumps out, whereas in the Uncharted ones they tend to be further away. But even then, in Uncharted you would have little set pieces where the enemy was all on top of you, and you're pressing a button to get them off or whatever. So, there's not that much to distinguish them, and I think that's one part where you just have to rely on the audio visual aspect. And so Dragon Quest 9, I don't really play the Dragon Quest games, but I've seen pictures of them and they look more Wind Waker than Majora's Mask. You know what I mean? It's very green, comfortable, light-hearted, cartoony looking thing. And I think that's what it is more than anything else. But of course the mechanics do need to match up with that. The Majora's Mask time thing in the Wind Waker art style wouldn't make a lot of sense, unless they went really twisted with the cell shading. But if it just played the Wind Waker art style really straight, where it was all happy and so, actually, you know what? That might be kind of good. There might be something kind of disturbing about having a really oppressive game attached to. But I suppose they kind of do that with Clocktown anyway, because Clocktown is kind of surface level, happy, Yeah, I don't know. I'm muddying my point here quite a lot. But I think it's more, the point I'm trying to make is it's more about a harmony between the gameplay mechanics and the audio visual. So I don't think you can really judge it just mechanically, at least not for a lot of games. Majora's Mask might be one of the most extreme examples out there, whereas something like Dead Space, you strip away all the other parts and you don't really know what to make of it on an emotional sort of level. So I think that I wanted to bring it up because I do think that we, and not to pick on you or anything, but we do sort of default to this thing of, how do I judge this game mechanically on this sort of level? But don't ignore the audio visual aspects. They're just as important, They're, well, maybe not just as important. I get shit for saying that, but, they are important. They are more important than some people give them credit for, and that informs you a lot about the game and what the developers wanted to achieve. And so I think I haven't played Dragon Quest 9, but I think you're absolutely right. Just based on the visuals, I could say it looks like the kind of game you just chill out and you play. And, if the battles aren't all that interesting or whatever, it's fine, because it's not supposed to challenge you all that much. It's just supposed to, you have a little bit of a grind and, you make your way through the world and it's nice and relaxing and you don't have to think too hard, Yeah, I think that's absolutely a valid thing for the game to do, and it's probably more the audio-visual quality of it that communicates that element to you. Okay, next question. The director of Kong Skull Island has talked up the idea of directing an MGS movie heavily. Do you think that MGS can be faithfully translated to a movie, or does its gameplay add to the narrative too much? I don't really know. I don't know who that director is. I don't know what he's been saying, but I think that MGS would probably be easier to adapt to a film than many other games, because it has so many filmic elements in it. Kojima is obviously a fan of film and has obviously gone to some lengths to try to recreate that enjoyment in his games. I do think that they would be missing something, though, absolutely. And I think that the best example for me would be something like the end in MGS3. There's just absolutely no way to make that come across in a film as good as it does in the game. I think it might be my highlight in the entire series, so maybe I'm a little bit biased towards it or whatever, but the reason I like it is I just think it's really good. And it captures that feeling of battling against a sniper, I know some people now, if you're a speedrunner or whatever, you really know what you're doing. You can go in, you can beat them in a few minutes, or, I don't know, 30 seconds probably. But for a player who's just getting into the game and wants to get into it properly, coming back to that immersion aspect, you can either run around or you can actually take it on like a sniper battle, so you're kind of you want to engage with the game on the level that was intended. But anyway, um, if you go and you fight the end that way, you can be a long time. It can be one of the longest boss battles I've ever seen. Anyway, I think it took me about half an hour on my first attempt, and I think I said in my review it could probably take upwards of an hour, and I imagine it probably did for some people. So I just think that's really cool, just the fact that they were willing to do that and draw a boss battle out so much, because that's the way, whether it's true or not, I don't know, because I'm not big on war stuff. But that's certainly the way I think of a sniper battle, is that it's this long, drawn out, slow, looking really closely in the distance before you move even slightly sort of thing, that's the image that I have in my mind, and MGS3 allowed me to experience that properly. That would be completely lost in a film. It wouldn't be captured the same way. They could have a half an hour long sequence where Snake fights the end, and it wouldn't be quite the same thing, because you're not the one doing it. But I think even like, let's face facts, some of the more well-known, more well-beloved parts of Metal Gear Solid are the interactive parts, even if they're not the actual gameplay. The best example is Psycho Mantis. Psycho Mantis in MGS1, everybody loves it. Everybody, everybody loves that bit. He reads your memory card. He makes you put the controller on the floor. He makes you swap the controller port, And none of those things can happen in a film. None of them. They will never have the same impact in a film. Psycho Mantis going, oh, I see you like Castlevania, or whatever it is. You can't do that in a film. There's no way to replicate it. And so even though it's not part of the actual gameplay, it is just one of those little Metal Gear Solid things that you can't have in a film. And I think a film would suffer for that. So you can probably tell that I'm not the biggest fan of even trying to turn games into films in the first place. I just don't really see the point. But then again, I am somebody who can play and enjoy games, and I'm sure there's a whole load of people out there who don't play games who might enjoy the stories of things like Silent Hill. I haven't seen the Silent Hill film, but if you were never going to play Silent Hill, or if you're one of those people we were talking about earlier who can't play a game with tank controls, like just can't do it, then maybe the Silent Hill film is the only way that you're going to experience that. So I suppose in that sense it has value. But for me, kind of like what I was saying before, is that the goal isn't to make a film so that they can experience it. The goal is to try to get them to play the game, The goal is to say you actually can play and enjoy this game, and try to find a way for people to do that. So that's why I don't think the films are valuable. But some people will watch them and enjoy them, so whatever. But yeah, the gist of my answer there is that I do think that something would be lost in translation along the way. Whether you actually value those things or not is up to you. I didn't even talk about the actual core gameplay that happens in most of the game in my examples. And obviously there's a lot of merit to that. That's what the game is built upon. So that's all lost as well, obviously. So I don't see the point myself. I think that we could be making better films, making films about original things that work well as films, rather than spending the money trying to chase the game audience. But anyway, I think I might leave it there because my throat is getting a bit worn out, and we've been at about 2 hours, which seems right. I had more questions picked out, but I don't know, maybe I can save them for another day. It's pretty hard to actually get through. I have over 400 questions on the Ask now, so it's even becoming, I don't want to say a chore, but that was the first word that came to mind, which might inform you of my state of mind. It's kind of becoming, honestly, a chore to go through the list and even pick out the good ones, So at some point I might just have to bulk delete them. I don't know. I really don't want to do that, but it takes so long. It's taken me this long to answer 800 questions. Another 400 is just mind-boggling. I'd be at it for days to try and give a good answer to each one of those. So I'm sorry that I can't. There's so many questions that I can't get around to. I really am. If you didn't get picked for this one, I'm really sorry. I appreciate that you sent in questions anyway. I think a lot of people sent me questions that actually weren't about games. I asked for games related questions, but a lot of people send in sort of industry related things. And I tend not to talk about that. I might go down that well at some point since I'm doing the podcast. I would kind of prefer not to, though. I think I would be doing it just for the sake of it, so I'm not really sure I want to. And I would rather wait until I get good questions about the actual content of games themselves than, about the industry, because I don't know, it's just, something that I think can actually get in the way of your enjoyment of games, and actually isn't really relevant a lot of the time, if you know what I mean. So, and I don't want to dwell on it, or yeah. So I'm not sure what else to say. If you've listened to this, I hope it was enjoyable. Um, I'll try to get around to doing another one at some point. I didn't mean to leave it a whole month before doing the last one, but anyway, I'm not going to clog up these podcasts with a whole lot of housekeeping stuff. So, thank you everybody for listening, and I'll see you next time.